5:30, and we will call the special board meeting to order for the workshop on charter schools. May I have roll call, please, Michelle? Michelle, are you ready? Okay, may I have roll call, please?
Anderson? Anderson? Delgado?
Present.
Jacobs?
Here.
Levy?
Here.
Larson?
Here.
Wong?
Here.
Miller?
Present.
And is Anderson here?
I think he's working.
Okay, then we have 6 of the members virtual.
All right, thank you. May I have approval of the agenda, please?
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the agenda. Any questions or discussion regarding the agenda? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, the agenda is approved. So before we get started, I would like to remind board members, please use the chat box only to get my attention. If you would have a question or would like to speak, they cannot see that on YouTube, so it's not public, and so we want to be transparent. And also, I want to let everyone know that we invited, or Lisa Firstef and Christy Cole from the Lincoln Academy were kind enough to reach out to board members individually, and we invited them here to participate tonight because board members felt that this is an appropriate place. And originally they had agreed to participate, and recently they decided not to. So tonight joining us, we have Sarah Hackett from the, this is a long title, from the Wisconsin Resource Director. What was that?
I must have delay. I was just
Sarah? Okay, so we have Sarah Hackett is the director of the Wisconsin Resource Center for Charter Schools, and she also has her assistant director here with us tonight, Nick, and they will take it over from here.
Yeah, I am on. Can people hear me? This is Nick Bertaski, Associate Director for the Wisconsin Resource Center for Charter Schools.
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure. Sarah seems to be having a little bit of technical difficulties, and that's okay. I can kind of kick it off, and then maybe if she resolves a little bit of that, then we can have her expertise as well. So I'm going to share some slides with you. I think do I have access to share my screen? Is that right?
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, perfect. I will do that. Or Sarah maybe is going to. Let's see. Yep, perfect. Yeah.
I know.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Sarah. I don't know if you can hear me, but for some reason, yeah, you're choppy, so we can't make out what you're saying. That's not just me, right? Could someone just give a thumbs up that that's happening? Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I can kind of start, and then Sarah. I mean, if you want to chat me to some things to make sure I cover it all, but. Again, welcome. Thank you for having us. We're excited to be able to join you and hopefully answer questions, be a thought partner with you, provide, if we leave here fulfilling all of your needs, your interests, your thoughts, your concerns, then we're doing our job. But before we start, could you just jot down on a separate sheet of paper or somewhere, could you just think about what questions do you have or what major concerns do you have? Think of the word charter school. And we know that there's a new charter school potentially happening in your community. And so what are your initial thoughts with that? Because we want to make sure that we hit every one of those today. Otherwise, it could be, it's not as rewarding, right? If we just tell you a whole bunch of things that we think you should know, and we do not take care of the things that you want to know. So we really want to make sure that we get those done. So if you want to just take a time to jot those down. And then maybe we can jump to the next slide. Perfect. So we're going to briefly introduce ourselves. We are the Wisconsin Resource Center for Charter Schools, the WRCCS. A lot of people just call us WORKS for short, as Kyle alluded to. It's a very long title to our office. We're a statewide center, so we support schools, school districts all over the state, but we are based out of CESA-9, and we're funded through a federal grant that was given to the state of Wisconsin. And with that grant, the state of Wisconsin DPI asked that a center be created to make sure that any new charter schools that were to start were getting the proper supports, both authorizer, governance board, charter leadership, in order to be highly effective, as well as for all the other charter schools in the state as they're recontracting, going through, maybe leadership changes, governance board changes, repurposing, that we are helping support them to make sure that they are meeting their mission and vision, and they are also high performing charter schools, and or working with them if their charter school is not working in their community. How do we support their authorizers with those steps as well? We serve and provide technical assistance, such as this call here is a really good example of how districts can reach out to us. We can have question and answer sessions. We go in and do authorizer trainings. We do governance board trainings. We have a mentorship program. And not only are we available, we have partners from around the country and around the state that we can make available to you. All of our services are free since we're funded out of a federal grant, as well as if you go to our website, wrccs.org, you will find more resources there than you're probably willing to read through. But if you cannot find something there, we will be your diagnostic tool to assess what those needs are that you're looking for, and we can quickly identify the resources that you may be looking for, if it's documents or best practices. Jump to that next slide. You're muted, Sarah, but it does look like you actually have, I don't know. Oh, you're on the phone.
You don't look frozen anymore, Sarah, so you might be able to speak now if you unmute your computer.
Okay, I was connected with my phone. Does that look better?
Yes.
Yes.
How about now?
Yep, you look good.
And you can hear me?
I can.
Hey, you guys, it's magic. So Nick, I switched to the partners slide. Would you like to keep going? You're doing a lovely works introduction.
Yeah, perfect. So
Okay.
these are our partners. We work with 20 organizations around around the state, as well as the nation, that have expertise in the world of charter. We recognize that we only know what we know, and we know that we're better off partnering with organizations, as well as 25 different mentor schools from around the state we work very closely with. Those mentor schools are charter schools that have been at least through one full contracting period, and they're labeled highly effective because they meet their mission and vision that they were set out to meet. And so we use all of those partners as well as our mentor schools to create some of the resources, as well as be those technical assistance guides as we get into the weeds. Oftentimes, Sarah and I like to refer to ourselves as general practitioners. When you go to see us, we can help diagnose maybe what you're looking for. And then if we need to get a very specific surgery done, there are experts around the country that are very good at that we can put you into contact with if we didn't feel comfortable addressing those needs.
Great, thanks. And I jumped you ahead right away, so you can roll right in.
These are the technical assistance that we typically provide. So we do trainings throughout the state, such as this one tonight. And we do personalized support for any issues that may arise, again, for the authorizer, school districts, and other governmental entities that are authorizing charter schools in our state, as well as governance boards that need training or support in contracting work or leadership accountability. We have online courses, 49 different online courses that we've provided. So if you are not a synchronous learner and you'd rather learn just in time on your own, you can access those courses as well. And then finally, I mentioned that we have a portfolio, a wealth of resources and online documents.
And I link out to that later in the slideshow too, and I'll share all of this afterwards.
Perfect. I'm passing to you.
Okay, good. So thank you so much for being
here.
And I'm so sorry my internet was not working, but we're here now. So works program goals, and we're going over this work stuff just so you can kind of have a context of the work that we've been doing with charter schools around the state, because you're going to hear a lot from us this evening. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes to give you that context. So our work is really to support schools to meet the needs of all learners. We work with all sorts of school districts around the state, lots of charter schools at all, kind of around that whole spectrum that Nick was just alluding to just really think creatively about, different ways to meet students' needs. And so in order to do that, we're building relationships among schools, among facilitators, among coaches at CISAs and universities, and all sorts of connections to just really build up those supports for schools, and then build that resource warehouse that Nick was mentioning, so that everything is free and open and available to just really move this work forward. So our plan for this evening, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just jump in? I just want to also really make sure that, and we would say this to any audience, charter schools are not always the answer. And we absolutely recognize that. So when we work with school districts and we work with communities, sometimes charter schooling, as we go through the process, is an absolute answer to a community need. And we can build a program, and we can build a budget, and we can build performance measures around that to create a charter school. And then other times, programming, or there are other community organizations that are serving that need. So please know that we're here to serve your community. And at the end of the day, what we want is in the best needs of kids. And if a charter school is to help us meet those needs, then great. If it's not, then we need to help you work with your community to find a different solution.
That's true, Nick. That's super helpful to kind of just present that context that, while we create all these resources and build connections and, think about charter schools a lot of our day, we're really not advocates, for any of that work. We're just here to help schools think through what are the right choices. And so certainly Nick and I have both had lots of conversations over the last few years with folks who are kind of weighing what kind of school they want to be, or if they want to be a program, maybe they are a charter and they don't think they want to be a charter anymore. So there's just a lot of those broader conversations and meeting the needs of our kids. So it just happens to be kind of funded through the charter schools grant. So that's kind of been the primary focus.
Sarah, Nick, I'm sorry, can I jump in for 1 second?
Absolutely.
And I wanted to reiterate to the community and to the board too that I know the Lincoln Academy is the charter school that's most glaring. That's what we're kind of wrapping all this context around. But that's not the purpose of tonight. We don't currently have any charter schools in our district. We have had them previously. So this is to help educate the community as well as the board on if somebody came to us and said they wanted a charter to start an instrumentality, the board would have that background knowledge to understand what that meant and how that would affect us, and how to go forward with that process.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then I do have a question. If a board member has a question along the way, do you want them to just jump right in, or do you want to wait until the end for questions?
Yeah, I could do it either way. We have a lot of time set aside. And so my thought was, I've got, I don't know what it ended up being, maybe 20, 25 slides to just sort of fly through kind of some general overview, what are charter schools, what are authorizers, what does the process look like, what are governance boards, and just get some of those basics out of the way. And then we can dive deeper into some of the individual questions. Okay. I think when I was with your board a few months back, we did it a little more loosey-goosey and kind of just, I had my slides handy and I bounced around based on what folks had for questions. So I am happy to do it either way. Does the board have a general feeling one way or the other?
I think perhaps going through and then we can ask questions at the end if you go through the slides quickly and everything. I think that's fine.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds great. Any other questions before I'll jump into my charter overview then in a few minutes. Great. So I just talked through my plan for the evening. Oh, did somebody have a question? No, just feedback maybe. I would like to maybe take breaks throughout too. I don't know what you normally do for a 3-hour board meeting, but I thought at some point we should probably take 5 minutes just so people can step out of the room if they need to. So I will try to do that as we kind of move along here. But once again, Nick is my associate director who so graciously was on and stepped in for me in my kind of floundering a few minutes ago. And then I'm Sarah, and we are here to support you and just kind of try to answer as many questions as we can tonight. So if you have anything for us that's real pressing, or if I'm going too fast, certainly jump in. But otherwise, I do think we're going to have lots of times for questions as we go along. So we're going to start with a charter schools overview. And I just wanted to set the context a little bit for schools in Wisconsin. So something that we work on is just helping people think through what are their choices if they're a parent or community member, what sorts of schools are offered in their community, and what are the options? And if they're a school district leader, how do you build resources within your district that can really serve all families? And so oftentimes we get questions just around like, well, is a charter school a private school? And is it like this? And where is virtual school? And so I made this map, and I don't think it's perfect, but it just sort of helps me, being a visual kind of person, just sort of box things out a little bit, like where do they go? So I apologize, some of the text is fairly tiny, but to just take a minute and think through from a parent perspective, there's public school options and there's non-public school options. The non-public school options include private schools and homeschooling. There's some different kind of flavors of that sort of fall under those two buckets. I mean, homeschooling can look like a co-op with families. It can be an individual family or student, or it could be where the family purchases some curriculum, which may be online. So there's that piece, which is not affiliated with any school. Private schools have tuition or scholarship-based programs. And then, as you guys know, in your region, there's also voucher choice program options within some of the private schools. So that's kind of all over in the non-public school option wing for parents. Over here in the public school option wing, there are resident school district options or open enrollment into that school district. And then I'll kind of go through some of those choices. But before we get there, then there's also this non-district independently authorized charter school, which does fall under that branch of the tree under public school options, though it's not affiliated with a district. And then I'll just sort of jump back over and finish the school district piece. So within the school district, parents have choices of their neighborhood school, inter-district enrollment, or actually that should be intra-district enrollment to other neighborhood schools. There's different district programs. I probably didn't even capture them all here. Those would not be charter schools. Those are just programs that students can enroll into, get nominated for, opt in to do part-time. And then there's also district authorized charter schools that could be instrumentalities or non-instrumentalities. I'll get to that in a minute. But the district authorized charter schools could also be brick and mortar or virtual. And there does have to be a lottery to get into those charter schools. So it's a little bit different than a program, and it would have a governance board. I'll get into that. So I just wanted to kind of paint that initial scene, and we can always come back to this slide later once I give you a little bit more context. So I think I'll move on. I know that's heavy. There's like a lot there, but I'm going to dig into the charter school pieces now a little bit. So charter schools defined. Charter schools are public, non-sectarian schools. I'm going to say that again. Charter schools are public, non-sectarian schools created through a business-like contract or charter between a governance board of the charter school and an authorizing school board or other chartering entity. And I will pick this apart over my next couple of slides, but the main takeaway here is the public piece. We have charter schools all throughout Wisconsin. They look like a whole variety of kind of formations. You know, some of them are big, some are small, some are part of districts, some aren't. There's virtuals, there's schools in the woods, there's schools in renovated buildings. They do STEM, they do classical education. There's all sorts of different types. And we maintain a yearbook at Works that kind of helps you sort through all those different charters to really just get an idea of the landscape. And so to me, I find this really helpful to be able to look at that map view, but then also zero into the data. So this links to our yearbook that we maintain on our website. And I think that's a good resource to just help paint the scene, knowing that there really are charters in every CISA in our state, in rural and urban, kind of spread all over. Here's another one of Nick and I guess, just like making visual representations of things. So here's one we've been working on recently to help people understand the funding streams of charter schools. I'm tempted to just almost come back to this, but maybe we'll just circle back around to it a little bit later. I'll just touch on it briefly. Like I said, there are district charter schools, and then there are independently authorized charter schools. Of the district authorized charter schools, there's instrumentality and non-instrumentality. I haven't defined those for you yet, so I'm going to come back to this slide once I've defined them for you. But just the takeaway initially is just that the instrumentality schools are staffed by the school district. The non-instrumentality schools are staffed by the governance board. Independently authorized schools staff their schools through their governance board. and their money comes through a state allocation directly to the governance board of the school. And like I said, we can come back and kind of get into the nitty-gritty of that in a little while. But there is that distinct separation. And so, like you mentioned, Kyle, if you guys were as a district to authorize a school, that just the funding and kind of how that all that back end is structured does look a little bit different. So let me get into this whole authorizer and governance board thing, because I apologize. I've been using those terms a little bit already, and I haven't defined them for you yet. So that's what the next handful of slides will cover. So we work very hard at Works to focus our work on the charter contract. It's something that's always been a piece of charter schools, but we've felt like even for existing charter schools, it often wasn't strong enough. And oftentimes when schools close or when they struggle, when problems happen, it often comes back to that charter contract not really articulating all of the pieces of what makes a solid charter school. So really what ought to happen in that charter contract is that the charter school authorizer grants autonomy to a charter school governance board, and in turn, the governance board produces results for the authorizer. So it's permission to innovate and do work differently, but in turn, they're held to very high standards to make sure that the operations, the finances, and the academic performance are all accounted for and reported on regularly, so that the authorizer can, in good faith, renew that contract every few years. So let me define those terms for you on the next few slides. So like I mentioned, the charter school authorizer's role is to oversee approving an application for a charter school, so deciding to be an authorizer of that school, and then negotiating the contract and working through those terms and performance measures, overseeing the school over the course of the contract, and then after typically 5 years, deciding whether or not to renew the contract or close the school at the end of the contract. And they would typically monitor that year to year, working up to that 5-year cycle. So the National Association of Charter School Authorizers has a ton of resources out there about best practices. They do networks. They have tons of resources for, kind of how to do each of those stages. And we've really built on those resources in Wisconsin. Let me tell you about the authorizers then. So every single public school district in the state is able to be a district authorizer per the statutes. About 100 of the districts currently authorize, though a few of them have formerly authorized and a few of them are considering authorizing in the next few years, but roughly around 100, so about a quarter of the school districts have at least one charter school. Some of them have quite a few more. The statutes also articulate that every public institution of higher ed in Wisconsin is allowed to authorize. And so that's every chancellor of every 4-year or 2-year UW system school, every technical college's board. So right there, that's quite a few, institutions across the state. We also have the Lecoutre and Menominee community colleges and the UW System Office of Educational Opportunity. So that is the state administrative system office, that oversees all the UW system schools. So they have that central statewide office, and they've been actively authorizing. Lecoutre is actively authorizing, and the chancellors of UW Milwaukee and UW Parkside are authorizing currently. So just to sort of give you a handful, to give you an idea of that, a handful of those higher ed institutions are actively authorizing. And then additionally, we have the non-educational public government entities like the Council of the City of Milwaukee and then the Waukesha County Executive's Office. And the City of Milwaukee does authorize schools. Waukesha County Exec team is not chosen to do that yet. So that's a lot, again, to absorb, but to just sort of help you paint that landscape of like, who are these authorizers? You know, it can be school districts, and the majority of the schools in our state are authorized by school districts. But then we do have quite a few of these higher ed institutions and other public entity authorized schools as well. And then, you know, like I mentioned, the majority of our schools in this state are authorized by school districts, and that's very similar to the national landscape too. So this slide shows the national landscape of kind of who authorizes. And so we don't have our state agency, it does not have the ability to authorize. Nonprofit organizations do not have the ability to authorize here. An independent state with no state agencies. So all of those bottom four we don't have here. We have the universities, the school districts, and then those other couple public entities. So I think that that's just helpful to sort of see that context. All right, so here's a written definition for you, and then I can go back to that finance slide in a minute. But the instrumentality district schools are authorized by the school district and also staffed by the public school district. So it can sometimes become a struggle for a school district that has a contract with the school board to run the school, but then the school district also is the employer of the governance board school. And so there's just sort of a little bit of an interwoven relationship there. The non-instrumentality district schools are authorized by the school district. So the school district holds all of those accountability pieces, but they're staffed by the governance board. And then the governance board's role is to make sure that that staff is responsible and fulfills everything that's in the contract. So it's a two different kind of ways that they function, but both are considered district authorized charter schools. Wisconsin's governance boards now. So this is the other side. If I go back a couple of slides to my circles here, we talked about what the authorizer is on that side of the contract. Now I'm just going to talk for a minute about the governance board on that side of the contract. So the governance board's role, they are an established entity filed with the state of Wisconsin DFI office. So they have to be an incorporated entity. Most of them are non-stock, nonprofit, tax-exempt entities. And they are held accountable to their authorizer through that contract's performance measures. And they are also held to their bylaws, which include following all public meeting laws. So those boards, while they're not elected boards in the same way that you're elected, they are, they're public boards. They have public meetings, they follow bylaws, they have election procedures, they have policies in place. Everything is, open records and posted, and that all of their performance measures are accountable to that school district or university's board of regents to maintain everything that's in the contract. And so I just wanted to kind of paint a picture of sort of who these boards are. And if you have more questions about that, certainly we can come back to that later. So then this is kind of, again, Nick and I just love these visuals. So I'm just going to share a couple of them with you. We have on the authorizer side, it's really that oversight, that renewal decision, and setting the expectations initially of like, what school would we even want to authorize? The governance board often comes with the mission and value of the school and kind of that concept. They handle the operations, the staffing, and budget. And sometimes in a district charter school, some of that operations, staffing, and budget is shared with the authorizer, but done really intentionally. And then together, they really decide on what the accountability and performance measures are going to be, and kind of set up a system for reporting that performance. Oh, there's another one, strategic vision. I thought those were spaced out funny. So there you go. They really maintain that vision together as well. So let me just see, before I get into why we have charter schools, I'm sorry for making you dizzy here. I really want to go back to that finance one. So now that I've defined the instrumentality and non-instrumentality, I can kind of get into the meat of this a little bit. So the statement under instrumentality and non-instrumentality you'll see is the same, because really, functionally, a charter school's budget is determined in a school district through the contract. And so a school district may decide that the entire per pupil amount is allocated to the governance board, and then the governance board purchases services back from the school district. Or the school district may decide that we're going to cover X, Y, and Z, and so we're going to sort of take this much budget off the top of each per pupil allocation, and then whatever's left over is sort of the discretionary piece that's used for the charter school, vision fulfillment. It varies hugely by district and even by school, sort of just depending on how that contract is negotiated and what they want that relationship to be like. Often it depends if the school is located within another school and they have a co-located charter school, that may change how they divvy up their budget and expenses like heating costs and custodial and things like that. Versus if they sort of have their own building. So we certainly see a lot of variation with both instrumentalities and non-instrumentalities in kind of how they set up their budget within the district. And the difference of the non-instrumentality is that the staffing allocation would go to the governance board in the case of a non-instrumentality, so that they could take that and use it for their staffing purposes outside of the district systems. So then as you sort of move over into the independent charter schools side, it used to always be set up as 2X and 2Rs. Well, and even before that, it was only 2Rs. And so it was a little bit easier to articulate. So bear with me, because I think I had to kind of hear this from DPI about 7 times before I finally felt like I could wrap my head around it. So the 2R schools, kind of going back to the beginning, are any of those non-district authorizers in the state, which for a long time was just UW-Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, and UW-Parkside. Kind of along the way, a few more were added, and then a few more were added. And so there are new 2R authorizers, and there's the 2X authorizer now, which is only the Office of Educational Opportunity at UW system. So the 2R and 2X come directly from the statutes. It's the line item and statute number. And so 2X is the establishment of that UW system office and ability to authorize. And the 2R is a different, just slightly higher part of the statutes that kind of lays out those different universities and public entities that are allowed to authorize and how the funding and everything would be set up. So the legacy 2R authorized schools, the allocation comes from a statewide aid funding formula. And so they... last year it was $8,900 per pupil. There's like a flat rate. I think this year it might go up to like $9,000. It seems like it's crept up about $100 each year over the last few years. Now the 2X and new 2R authorized schools like the Lacoudere College, and if any other universities choose to start authorizing, those allocations are also kind of, given directly to the governance board at that set amount, but that allocation comes from the state funding pool that would have otherwise gone to that student's resident district. So it doesn't exactly come out of the resident district's budget, but it comes out of their formula while it's still at DPI and they're sort of calculating. They look at the students that are enrolled in that school, where their home district would be, and then calculate, how much goes to that school, and then that state allocation would be deducted from the resident district. So not where the school is located, but where that student is coming in from. Okay, so then on top of all that, there are also special ed aids that can sort of be added to those allocations. And then there's also just kind of variations. And that's why I say this is a visual to try to make something very complex a little bit simpler. But certainly there's all kinds of other, grants and lunch programs, special ed, Bureau of Indian Affairs, title money, all sorts of different things that can come into play. And then additionally, authorizers generally charge administrative fees. And so those would be deducted from the budgets as well and would go directly to the authorizer. So there's lots of layers, and there's no real one way that everyone does it. I mean, our districts, like I said, even within our instrumentality district authorized schools, there's huge variation over their budgets. And then, that kind of just carries all the way through all of these. So budgets are a hard thing around charter schools, and certainly something people spend a lot of time on, thinking about, worrying about, trying to figure out, and also just navigating in general. So certainly, I'm guessing you're going to have some questions there, and we can come back to it as we go along. So let me jump, and I'm going to just talk a little bit more about why we have charter schools. So let me see if I click, there we go. Authorizers start charter schools, governance boards start charter schools, school leaders do, and so do classroom teachers. And so I just wanted to kind of have that for a minute, that each of those entities may have unique reasons for why they're interested in having a charter school. And so to just answer this really simply of like, well, here's why people have charter schools, it's not the case. I mean, because we just really see huge variation in kind of that need. And so I wanted to just take a minute to talk about, some of the exercises, and Nick does an excellent job at working with schools to just really talk about their needs assessment in order to determine their design. So sometimes we get calls from any one of those stakeholders saying, we're interested in a charter school, or we think we might want to do this, or, we've got this design team that's really interested in tackling some innovation. And so then we really have to get back to like, well, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? Or why do you think that this is something that would make sense for your community right now? And so, we work a lot on talking about, how are you serving educationally disadvantaged students? How are you addressing achievement gap issues for your different subgroups? Are you thinking about losing students to open enrollment, losing students to choice schools? What is the concern? Do you feel like you don't have great staff retention? There's all sorts of reasons that we hear from districts as to why they're interested in kind of trying something new, adding more layers to their school district or more options within their community. And so having them do some needs assessment and talk through that root cause analysis, I think is super important, no matter if they're a district superintendent, if they're from a university. We've done these exercises with those folks. We do it with governance boards, who often include community members and parents who are interested in seeing change. And we do it with school leaders and teachers who are thinking, I really want to educate kids in this way instead of this way. And how can we, repurpose our tools to kind of do things differently? So we spend a lot of time on needs assessment in that way. And then we've spent some time gathering case studies from charter schools to just really analyze how districts and communities are meeting their needs through charter designs. And like Nick really aptly mentioned earlier, it's not always the answer to have a charter school. But sometimes it is, and sometimes it is temporarily, or sometimes it is long term. And so we've seen all sorts of different models sort of come to fruition. But just to talk briefly, we've seen charter schools form as an innovation center, trying a new practice, trying a new kind of, physical space structure, either a new curriculum or an instructional format. And then those practices can spread throughout the district, or maybe they stay isolated. And I think that those innovation centers are really the way that we've seen some districts in particular kind of pilot those ideas. We've seen charter schools help with learning improvements in order to meet the needs of all learners, understanding that not all learners are the same, and so offering them choices in how they receive their instruction can really be beneficial and capture and help more students be successful by diversifying their options. We've seen schools ask for more autonomy than their district has afforded them. And with that, they've agreed to increased accountability. So they say, not only will we do all the, kind of end goals of every other school in the district with the state tests and, with attendance and behavior and, all their obligations, but additionally, they'll show more measures of performance or higher measures of performance for the exchange of being allowed to sort of do learning differently. And so we certainly see examples of that all throughout the state. Financial stability is an interesting one because I've heard it go both ways over the years. But recently, we've seen a lot of districts who have open enrollment issues, kids open enrolling out to virtual schools or neighboring districts who have some innovative models. And so they're trying to bring their kids back home. And so in trying to bring your kids back to your district, you kind of, you increase your bottom line by being able to serve those kids who were opting out and potentially serve some kids who opt in. Community connection. We've seen districts who really want to utilize things within their community, resources, opportunities, facilities, nature centers, maker labs, community colleges, things like that, to just like enrich the learning experience and kind of create those really strong partnerships. And so they do that through a charter design sometimes. And then I kind of alluded to family and student choice, and somehow I deleted it, but I also wanted teacher in here because I think, giving those opportunities, just like all families and all students wouldn't choose the same design. Neither would teachers. Teachers have different learning styles and environmental preferences too. So that's just a handful of kind of our analysis of what's going on throughout the state. So here's our charter school map. Again, one more of our beautiful, colorful iterations of this, complicated work. So again, you don't have to absorb the whole thing. It's just a quick look, but knowing that charter schools really do go through a long and iterative process in their creation and in their life cycle. So we really start with a need, kind of go through these initial phases of development, create a contract, make sure that, your whole team is really thinking about all of these performance and accountability pieces. And then you kind of continue to go through your life as a charter school, and there's constant performance and accountability benchmarks, and then this continuous reauthorization process in which, your authorizer may add additional expectations that you're replicating, you're expanding, you're disseminating, or eventually that you work your way towards a point of dissolving because your practices have moved beyond the charter school. And so, we've seen lots of, we called this a lifespan initially, And then I said, well, that means that it dies like a butterfly, like, or something. And so we decided not to call it a life cycle, but I do think it's kind of a nice roadmap to understand that cyclical process. All right, I'm getting to the end of my slides here because I know you all are going to have a lot of questions, and I'll plan to go back. But this is kind of a list view of the previous slide. And that's all I'll say about that. And then this kind of breaks it into, we have a few graphics around, what an authorizer does. But I just wanted to point out that each stage of a chartering process is an opportunity to really determine and manage that school's autonomy and accountability or performance. And so at that application stage, I work with authorizers and talk about, well, what sort of school would you want? Why would you have a charter school? Or are you really open to hearing all ideas? But as, your mission as a board and as an authorizing entity, what are you trying to accomplish? And is there a way that in that vision of your public school system, you see a role for charter schools? And you get to drive that as in that application process. What are the autonomies you'd be willing to grant? And what is the performance expectations for accountability that you'd be interested in seeing from a potential applicant? And you can put that out there. In the statutes, it actually says that authorizer's job is to solicit and review applications. And so you really put yourself in the driver's seat if you solicit applications, and you don't have to go out and, knock on doors, but I mean, you can, not that kind of solicit, but to just put a statement out or have a policy as a board that says, this is what we would potentially consider, and how often would we consider reviewing applications, and what does that look like? Do you have a rubric? Do you have a set of questions? Our office has some really great resources that you can take and mock up and use to make your own, what an application process would look like, what a charter school authorizing policy would look like, what a timeline would look like, and to just sort of kind of think through that and know that you control that process. And then the exact same thing at the contracting stage. You may decide that you really like an application for a charter school, but you do get to help drive that contracting phase. Just because you agree that you're interested in them, you still have that opportunity to contract and decide what are those autonomies that you're going to put into writing for that school, and then what are the performance accountability measures that you want to put into that contract. And then that will all drive the renewal. All of those, everything that goes in the contract would then drive, and your vision as a district, so it all sort of really goes together. But I think that it's important to think about that work as, every party really having a voice in that process. Okay, so this gets into some more brainstormy stuff, and maybe we'll come back to it. But, just it gives you an idea of some of those things that you might think about when you're soliciting an application for a charter school. What pieces of the school system you're working within do you feel like could use that spark of a new idea from a charter school application? Or would you really like to see changed results around any of these things or all of them? And, so we have some resources to kind of help you articulate what would be a sign of success if you were to have a charter school in your district. And then another kind of pondering thing that we can always come back to is that negotiation of the contract. What are those autonomies that you say, we want to control a lot of things as a district, but maybe, the curriculum that you choose to deliver could be different. and, everything else stays the same. The schedule, the busing, the space, the staffing, but just like that one piece changes. Or the technology that they use is different. Maybe they're delivering their same exact curriculum, but doing it through a different instructional strategy. Or maybe they are changing their schedule. They're going to do everything the same, but they're going to add an hour to their school day. I mean, there's some very small things. I guess things is a bad word, like innovations or choices, autonomies, that we see some of our schools propose in their applications and in their design. And so that's why I say, there's this push and pull between the authorizer and the governance board to create what are those autonomies and expectations. And there's just a whole menu of ones to choose from, or, to think about. And so I don't want to come here and just tell you that I don't have any answers because everybody looks different, but in essence, they often really do look different. And so I'll give you the best I can to group them, but just know that, every charter school contract in the state truly is different from every other contract. So there's just a lot to consider there. And so I say an example in this slide because as you create those negotiations, you also kind of break up roles and responsibilities. And so depending on what kind of charter school you are and how many of those autonomies you choose to write into the contract, some of these roles will fall into different buckets. But just generally, again, going back to the authorizer is the overseer that, kind of stopgap accountability for all the performance, the renewal, the contracting. The governance board oversees a lot of that kind of management and operations, transparency, holds the meetings, writes the policies, does a lot of that kind of operational work. And then the school leader is, sort of executes, implements the designs from the contract and all of the things that are in the contract. And it's really their role to make sure that all those performance measures are being met on a day-to-day, and they can kind of uphold everything that the governance board is setting forth and that the authorizer has agreed to. So it's this tiered relationship. And really, I mean, we see a similar structure in non-charter schools too. You have, I shouldn't even say this out loud because this, but like between the school board and the district superintendent, and then the building principals and the teachers, and maybe some, additional administrative staff at the district level and at the building level. You do have those tiers and that kind of division of roles and responsibilities and accountability. And so it's broken up, but it just looks different because you're sort of putting in this governance board piece that changes how you divide it up. Okay. This one has 1 million clicks, so I apologize here. I think that's all of them. Just another visual for that same kind of concept is like you have the authorizer doing the oversight, the governance board, which is a legal entity but they govern by policy, and then they help to hire the leader who is hires the staff and kind of implements the charter school. Additionally, just as with any school, there's sometimes outside service providers or contracts to purchase curriculum, professional development, management tools, and then potentially also outside sources to help manage some of the HR and financials, depending on the size of the school. Sometimes they would buy that back from the authorizer, and that's why there's this dotted line here. But that sometimes it's another entity such as a CISA or other contract partners. All right. I promise you we're getting to the end here. I can come back to this if you guys have some more questions too, but just real quick, in a district authorized school, the district stays the LEA, and so they're responsible for FAPE, for free and public education, or there's maybe another word in there. But they're in an independently authorized charter school. The governance board is the LEA, and so the governance board holds that FAPE responsibility. And then I just wanted to come back to this nice kind of, well, not really a Venn diagram, a cycle of kind of that charter school contract between that exchange between autonomy and results or accountability. And just, I think it kind of sums up a lot of what I just hashed through for you. So that's kind of the end of my charter school overview. I'm trying to think here if we should talk. This is just one slide, so I'll just kind of bounce back to Works for a minute. All that stuff that I just shared, it's all free and public. I'll, send this to you or put it out. I'll drop it in our public folder. We have just this massive, public archive of resources that's divided up for authorizers, governance boards, leaders, teachers, and then the general public, and also for parents and families. And so we really want to make sure that everybody kind of has things that are relevant to them, but it's all free and available. We also hold a free virtual conference in a couple of weeks. And so everyone is welcome to join and learn more about authorizing governance boards, charter schools. You can kind of drop in and out as it works for your schedule. Certainly feel free to register for that. And then we provide personalized technical assistance, like Nick had mentioned earlier. And so, just as Nick and I are joining you tonight, we also can follow up one-on-one with you, or, you can follow up with more questions or needing resources, and we can certainly provide all those to you. So with all of that, I wanted to give an opportunity to kind of come back to what Nick had you jot down at the beginning, some of your concerns, questions, things that you feel like are maybe misconceptions or needing more clarification on. And then I can always bounce back to other slides and pull up other resources as necessary. And if you don't have questions, I pre-generated a bunch of questions that are my next few slides too. But how about I stop sharing, and then we can see one another and just kind of have an opportunity to ask questions.
Go ahead, Dan.
First, I was going to say, no problem. First, I was going to say, Kelly, you're muted. Sarah, thank you for going through the background information in regards to the charter and all of that. And I think about a time when DPI and the rules that governed a lot of how schools were operated were very limiting, and the space for innovation was challenging, to put it in a good light. Given the changes and innovations that have occurred as a result of charter schools, what's been your advice that you've been giving school districts in that we have seen boards have policies that allow for schools to have different start times, and DPI having its District of Innovation applications that have allowed school boards to request waivers from things such as licensure, school length of days, some of the pieces that you've articulated. So how has the work of charters of your work changed as a result of the flexibility that both at the state and at the local level have created for the districts themselves to do some of this work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great, thank you. I love your historical context of, just thinking about, things in DPI world kind of change with the wind sometimes, but we try to follow along and, do the best we can to serve kids. So I think, like Nick and I mentioned at the beginning, like, we're not here to say districts should or shouldn't charter, but we're here to provide resources when they do. And so I think, we do have conversations with schools that have had charters for some of those reasons that you cited, and then realize that they don't really need the charter anymore and they close, which nationally is unheard of for charter schools that are performing well and have, results that families and teachers are really proud of and adopting kind of broadly. Then they say, okay, now let's close the charter school because you don't actually need it anymore, because you can do those innovative start times. You can do virtual programming. You can do, STEM and project-based work time for elementary schools and get high schoolers into work-based internship, apprenticeship programs. I mean, there's a lot that you can do without it. But I will say, so I guess let me stay on that tangent for a minute. We definitely have worked with districts to help them close their school and disseminate the practices outward. And we've worked with schools and districts who are thinking about an innovation and then decide to not make it a charter school because they think they can sort of implement it without the charter school. There are benefits to having the charter still in certain cases. And I think sometimes people feel safer having that contract and having that it all articulated, that we really truly have this permission to do this autonomy and that we promise you that we will get these results. And it's almost like when you just make yourself a to-do list in the morning, just to and then you put something on it that you've already done. It's just so you can cross it off, you just kind of want that peace of mind of no, this is articulated, it's public. There are stakeholders. There is, a plan that if we do these things, then this will continue. And it's not going to get lost when DPI's wind changes. And so I think that, and not to say that it doesn't ever, because sometimes, turnovers happen and schools end up closing. But I think it's just that kind of solid plan of attack and adherence to their mission. So, I don't think our work has changed a ton, Dan, but I do, I see what you're saying. And certainly there are examples where they're like, I think all of our kids can do project-based learning. So let's just kind of get rid of that charter school because it's a hassle, and it is. I mean, you juggle that extra contract and performance measures and governance board. But those are also layers of protection depending on the relationships within the community and their need to sort of have that. All of that is also to say that I think there's some additional autonomies that DPI isn't generally granting or that school districts would be hesitant to grant. A change in graduation requirements is sometimes hard to justify for some of your kids and not others if they're in the same school. So if you have a different high school within your district that has different graduation requirements, that's easier to just articulate within your community, that you don't say, oh, well, that kid's on a different graduation plan than that kid, even though they're in the same school. And so again, you totally could do it. But I think for districts, sometimes it's easier to have reporting systems or graduation plans or certain things kind of more compartmentalized so that people don't see it as an inequity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Megan, go ahead, please.
Sure. Yes. Thank you so much for your presentation, Sarah and Nick. It's very kind of you to share your time with us this evening. I put in the chat box that I have a few questions. I'm just going to ask one right now so that I can open up the opportunity for others. I do have to say that it makes my heart hurt a little bit when you talk about opening and closing schools, just because, I mean, I think we know that children rely on consistency, and I think we've seen that the really negative impacts of sudden school changes and just school changes at all with COVID here. But I also, I appreciate the value of maybe, creating permanent ways to embrace neurodiversity and other things that I think would be consistent needs. My questions then are more in regard to independent charter schools, which is the charter school that we're looking at here in our community. My first question has to do with oversight and accountability. I noticed that in the needs assessment, that was a really nice chart that you laid out there. What I'm curious about is the oversight from the authorizing agency. The reason that I ask is that having seen the application for the charter school that's been proposed for here in Beloit, there were a lot of claims made about the innovative nature of this school that actually are things that already are in our district to a very large extent. I can give you some examples if you want, but the point is, I'm wondering, one, what is, I guess, the accountability and oversight that the independent authorizer has to our community, since they're taking our community's school funding and removing it from 90% in their proposed rate from our district's children. And I guess I just want to look back at my notes. You just talked a lot about the benefits of charter schools and local control. It feels to me like the independent charter school, the independently authorized charter school, removes that local control. So again, my main concern overarching with this question has to do with, so how do we know what oversight, how do we know that they've even checked to see that the claims made in the application are correct? And what accountability does an unelected office in Madison have to the Beloit community? Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. I think you somehow managed to put like 7 questions in one question. So I'm like, okay, I'm trying to jot them down. No, it's good. I'll just tell me if I don't answer some of your question, because my mind's going in 3 different ways.
Yeah, so, and I apologize. That wasn't intended to be a gotcha to you. So yeah, no, we're good. Thank you. No,
it's good. Let's just break it down and then just keep asking if I didn't actually get to it yet. So, okay, so authorizer oversight. Again, I don't have a super clean answer. Our best guidance to authorizers is, and this comes straight from the National Association too, is that they should really be putting performance measures in the contract that are around operations, such as staffing, licensing, facility, things like that, that are all appropriate and legal and transparent. Financials, everything should be transparent and within budget, and it's all an open record sort of thing. And then the academic accountability, and so putting into the contract, like I know the UW Milwaukee schools have some really clear language in their policies now, where the students have to perform like, I can't remember how many percentile points above the state average and the MPS average in all the different academic areas in order for that school to be considered for renewal on their 5-year running. And so they keep those annual reports of all the financials, all the operationals, and they have these, really lengthy rubrics that they follow in all those different areas. They've got a really solid office in place. They've been open for a long time, and I think they produce an annual report that articulates all of that very transparently, and then it goes before the Board of Regents every year, and before the Board of Regents and their designated committee on renewal, every 5 years before they renew. So I think other authorizers set up similarly, but they all have the option to set up that process differently too. And so I bring it back to school districts, and I have worked with lots of school districts who don't necessarily go through all those pieces for their local charter schools. They sort of authorize the charter school, they write the contract, and then the charter school goes off and kind of does its thing. The district helps them along the way with a lot of those pieces. And I think often because it's so muddled in practice, they don't think about their job as an authorizer and think about those three big NACSA pillars, because they're like, oh, they're just one more of our schools. And so we control their financials and we control their performance. And like it sort of gets all clouded back together in a way that the oversight, I think, is actually more transparent in our non-school district charters, typically, because they don't have those systems in place that the charter school can sort of fall into. They're really building it from the ground up with that governance board. And so this is my, my long way of saying that I can't answer that for you because I don't know what their oversight is going to look like. Over the last few years, OEO's office, in the case of the authorizer that you're referring to, has done a really great job of building some of those systems and implementing them with their existing schools. But certainly it's kind of a continuous improvement process. The schools are finding that they'd like to add additional performance measures to better tell their story. And so they're kind of amending those contracts along the way, I think, or at least adding to their annual report. The only oversight that DPI holds over authorizers is a fairly simple annual report that just sort of has the authorizer report on the basic like financials and academic performance kind of stuff you'd see in a school report card, or honestly, it's stuff that DPI probably has access to anyway, but it's just sort of packaged up into an annual report that they send as an authorizer to the department, but the department doesn't actually have any there's nothing that would happen as a result of that report. It's sort of a report for transparency's sake, but it's not a report that has like accountability teeth in it. So it's not to say that, well, if the school is not performing and the authorizer is choosing to continue to authorize them, the school would not automatically get shut down because of the poor authorizing oversight, if that makes sense. And I think that that's similar to any local school. I mean, certainly all of our districts have, some of our local schools that are performing poorly on academics or struggling financially. When that report gets to DPI, they don't call and say, well, you have to shut down, your neighborhood school because it's poorly performing. But it is different. I see for a charter school that's authorized independently, because it isn't your local school board. It's a different board. It's a different couple of entities that are sort of overseeing it between the governance board and the authorizing office and board. And so you just kind of are reliant on those two entities to come up with tools and to hold the school accountable from those different perspectives. And then getting to the local control, I think that was the other part of your question, Megan. I agree. It's a different couple of boards. And I think that when a design team typically starts, often they approach a school district to be their authorizer. They may approach a local university to be their authorizer, a local tech school. And then they also may approach one of the offices that does statewide authorizing. Right now we have Le Coudray and OEO have both authorized schools statewide, and potentially a few other universities are certainly having those conversations. And so it does change the conversation. What I do know is that the universities who authorize statewide have really intentional discussions as they're going into that authorizing practice to, talk about, did you try authorizing this school with your school district? Did you try thinking about one of the other local institutions? before coming to one of those statewide offices, but they're not held to that. I mean, that's really sort of like a courtesy and questions and thinking about, well, what kind of relationship do you have with your community if you weren't able to work this out, as a district or with one of your local universities. And it just sort of helps them understand the context, I think, of the design team's vision. But yeah, I mean, like I said, we have a whole handful of schools now that throughout the state are opening up with university authorizers. And we also have more regionally authorized, independently authorized charter schools, like the ones around the greater Milwaukee area that are authorized by UW-Milwaukee. And for that authorizer, they were very intentional in saying that they wanted to keep a regional focus, at least for the time being. And so that Board of Regents is interested in that local control because they really want to authorize kind of the kids that they see in their space versus going statewide. So I think it's just a matter of scope and vision for those independent authorizers. And I think they see their scope and vision as that like local to them is their state, and so it's just like a different, and I understand as a school board member, that's hard to hear because your Beloit kids are your kids, and so it's just different. But I don't know. I'm just trying to provide some more context, I guess. Did I miss any parts of your question?
No, I appreciate that. I guess the only thing I needed some clarity on is the initial application. I appreciate that there are performance accountability measures that they make up for themselves, which is interesting. But I guess the thing I'm interested in is this needs assessment and the initial application that has to, by I believe OEO's own criteria, it has to be desired and innovative, provide something, an unmet need. They could make a claim that there's an unmet need. And I guess I'm just curious, what are the steps to ensure that that need is unmet? Because based on the application I've seen, I feel like there may not have been that check in this case. Just
right. And thank you. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're fine. You're good.
Yes, I hear you now, and I appreciate you kind of re-articulating that. So I have two immediate thoughts on that. One is that the application is fairly arbitrary, for lack of better words, because you as an authorizer can have any application process you want, and so can OEO. And, I don't mean to be too much of a brat to say, like, you could have them do an interpretive dance if you want. I mean, it really can be anything. And so, yes, I mean, I guess they asked those questions in the OEO application. They came up with an answer. And if the review team felt that was an acceptable answer, then, then it was put through. And maybe, honestly, maybe they didn't, maybe they didn't check those things. They just felt like the rest of the application was solid enough that they didn't need that. They didn't need that information at the time, or, maybe they felt like they didn't have a great way to find that information. It's possible that they did do some digging online and look at the state data. You could, like, WISE public portal is accessible. And so I imagine that there was some check there, but it's really none of that is, like, obligated, or, required of the school in order to be approved. And I think, that's what's interesting, but it goes also for your school district. I mean, I think it's getting late in the night, and I'm just gonna say all sorts of things but I was just gonna say, I've seen school districts authorize charter schools, over a drink and a handshake. I mean, I really think it's just like, hey, wouldn't that be a great idea? Okay, let's do that. And it doesn't really ever go through that process. And then certainly there are school districts who have really high threshold application processes and really strict application windows and procedures and, rubrics and, peer reviews and things like that. And they, may not authorize charter schools for, reasons that are much more micro than even the reason that you bring up, Megan, you know, so I think it very much varies, and there's nowhere that says that OEO has to approve any particular kind of application. They just created a process and stuck to it as, I wasn't part of that process, but I'm guessing, you know, based on what you've shared, that, you know, it's out there for public to see. There was a peer review, there were comments, you know, there was a decision made. I don't know, you know, yeah. I think
just to clarify, we open record, and wasn't our school board. A community group shared with me a locally open records requested copies, so that wasn't as transparent. But thank you, you've done a really thorough job of answering my question.
I would add to that too, Megan. You know, I think it should be open. You have the right to see that. So if for some reason you put in a records request and you were not able to get that, that would be a major concern. Their meetings should all be open to the public. Their evaluations and their annual report need to be on their website and filed. So that should be open to so you should see what their performance contracting is. I'm not sure if OEO mandated. A lot of authorizers, though, do have parent perception surveys as part of the evaluation. And so that, again, I recognize it's not your whole community. It's just the community that is going to that school receiving that perception. But I do see that. A lot of my work with districts and with our charters is around performance measures. I know OEO is working on a framework, and that framework would make it very transparent so that you would be able to see. And a lot of our independent authorizers have a very distinct framework with weighting, so that it's very clear when it gets to 5 years whether or not this school has met what they said they were going to meet. And that's that level of accountability that in our traditional system we don't necessarily have. We can lay that out, but we're not deciding on new contracts every 5 years, I should say. But I really hope that was available to you guys. And if not, like, that's a concern that I would like to know, because I think we need to work with people on making sure that stuff is available, especially throughout this process and throughout the years of authorizing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna let other people speak to this, but we can follow up. It makes me a little sad to hear we're talking about our children and funding for the other children in the community over a drink and a handshake. And it sounds to me like there are processes, but these processes were invented, and there's not a documentation of how this works consistently. So I guess that's really where a lot of my concerns lie, in the creation and the authorization initially. But I do appreciate you sharing that about, the accountability measures that will be in place once they get started with the funding that they'll be using from our district.
All right. Amy, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you being here tonight to answer some of our questions. A lot of information, but it's all pertinent. Do you have data that supports or refutes the idea that charter schools perpetuate segregation with respect to socioeconomic, race, or achievement data? And then the second part of my question, you spoke about lotteries. Do you have any data on student displacement once the cohort is set? And specifically around discipline or expulsion practices that may be vastly different from other local schools?
Okay. Again, I want to make sure I caught all the different parts of your question. So tell me if I don't, and I'm not trying to get around anything. I just maybe missed one. So let me start with the kind of racial segregation potentials of charter schools and kind of what's going on in our state there. So I have certainly seen a lot of that in the national news, and we try to just sort of follow and see, okay, what's going on in those schools that we work with every day versus stuff that we're hearing, from other cities and states around the country. And I think it's important to separate some of the national perspective and conversation around charter schools from what's happening in our state. But sometimes it mirrors and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it's worse, and so I want to make sure that when we look at our data here, that we're really looking at our data. I think that we have a spreadsheet that we pull, and we've just been kind of analyzing this summer of all the different kind of metrics that DPI collects from schools. And so I'm comparing school districts and community schools to charter schools and districts that have charter schools, and trying to look at all the different factors of students with disabilities, students without disabilities, the different racial demographics, and then also like ELL and non-ELL and stuff like that, and trying to just wrap my head around like, what does our data actually look like? But I haven't put anything out about that yet. But as soon as I do, I want to try to make some of those numbers more public. We started with the school closures piece, and Nick put some really good data together comparing like all this hype around, well, schools are closing left and right, and kids are being displaced and all this stuff. And really what's happening in our state, the far majority of the schools that close in our state really are closing because the practices have dissolved kind of, or have like disseminated into the district, and the school is no longer necessary. So the kids just keep on doing what they're doing. It's just not called a charter anymore. So for closures, that certainly, those kids all have a school that they're at, and oftentimes it's even right in the same classrooms that they were in the year before. It's just not categorized in the same way on paper. So I guess I didn't quite finish answering the first half of your question. I don't offhand have that data for you, but I would be more than happy to dig into it more. I mean, we've looked at, we use WiseDash, and we use some spreadsheets that you can pull from kind of the depths of DPI's website, that, it'll calculate and it'll list out all the schools in the state and all those different indicators, and you can kind of search and sort. And so we've been spending a lot of time with that data for specific school districts, but we haven't done Beloit yet. And we certainly haven't done everyone in the state, but I know Nick's been spending a lot of time on a few of your neighboring districts, or, kind of in your region of the state, and found some, really gross numbers, honestly. So just, I think there's struggle. And I think that some of it has to do with who's in charter schools. Some of it has to do with marketing, things like that. There's all sorts of reasons. So let me get to your second half, which is the lottery. And then I'm thinking Nick may have some thoughts on this, and I know he made us a really good resource that we use to coach schools too. But the lottery piece. So all charter schools have a lottery. Not all schools need to use their lottery because they're not all full. Especially our virtual schools generally don't have wait lists because they don't ever cap out. They just keep adding kids. But our brick and mortar schools do generally have a building capacity. And so then they have a certain number of seats at each grade level or in their overall school. Man, there's a whole bunch I could share about this. So one thing is if it's a conversion charter school, meaning the school building has been repurposed into a charter school, all of the kids who live in that resident area by statute have first placement within that charter school. And so that is one way to not displace kids, Amy. And then beyond that, if it's not a conversion charter school and it is a brick and mortar and they do have a wait list in place, then yes, there are, a certain number of fourth graders can get into that school, and the rest of the fourth graders would be, so I have to think there's two different ways this works. If they're a district authorized school or a non-district authorized school. If they're a district authorized school and they're part of the district, they already have a seat in that district. So they're guaranteed placement at any of the other neighborhood schools. If they're open enrolled into that school district, they have to pass through both open enrollment and the charter school lottery in order to be admitted into the charter school. So if they're not admitted into the lottery, but they are admitted into the district, they still have the opportunity to attend one of the other neighborhood schools. And if it's a non-district charter school, it's only the lottery hoop that they would need to get through. And if there's not a seat for them, then they would not be able, they'd be waitlisted. And then by default, they would still be enrolled in their neighborhood district or whatever district they're open enrolled into. Amy, I talked a lot. I don't know if I answered your questions. Do you want to come again?
Actually, no. Let's deal with the second part first, briefly.
Okay.
My concern is that if a lottery is being used as a guise, and then once you have your cohort developed, you displace quote unquote undesirable students that you don't want in your school. So that's the second part. And then the first part, it sounds like the data may be available, but has not been compiled in a way to answer the question I asked, which so we can just kind of table that first part. Yeah, but if you could address the second part, that would be great.
Yeah, and if you have somebody at your district, Dan, maybe you guys kind of work on that already, but if it'd be helpful, Nick and I could certainly, go through and kind of just list some of the regional schools and some of the charter schools and look at all those percentages and do some comparisons. We've done it for other communities and it's always interesting. So certainly we could offer that. But the lottery as a guise is super interesting. DPI. Oh, he says thumbs up. Okay. So we'll maybe.
I'll be in on that one.
Okay. Perfect. Sounds good. So to be continued there. Lottery as a guise. So this has happened. I think it happens more. I have to say it happens more outside of Wisconsin, but I don't know. I don't have data on that. I just have, I've seen some examples of it in Wisconsin, but more and more, I think that's kind of in our past, and we're working really hard to make sure that that doesn't happen. So through the contracts process over the last 3 years and for the next years moving forward, DPI has required that schools have certain benchmarks in place in their contract that clearly articulate that lottery process and that there are no preferences and admission requirements for the charter school, because that's written into our charter law. But oftentimes people do have historically kind of put things in there saying, well, but you have to play the violin, or you have to live in this area, or you have to, have been referred, or things like that. And none of those things are legal and none of those things are permissible in our state. And so the department is doing a better job kind of catching those things. And specifically for our schools that have the charter subgrants during this 5-year cycle, the department actually collects their admissions policy and requirements and procedures so that they can review and ensure as much as possible that those things aren't happening. But yes, I mean, I have certainly seen schools who say things like, well, this is, we only take these kinds of kids, or, you have to have X, Y, and Z in order to apply. But to top it off, even if you have all those things on paper, the practice and the reality is really different. Where you locate your school, how you talk about your school, how you advertise your school, who you hire, all these things. And so Nick's came up with this really great list of questions to just ask yourselves as a board and as a design team or as an authorizer or whoever you are, to just, if you feel that your school isn't as diverse as it ought to be for any number of ways, are you really clear that you serve students with special needs? Are you clear that you'll provide food and transportation? Do you provide wraparound care? All of these things that families think about and have come to expect from their schools. If you aren't talking about that you offer those things as a charter school, some people will assume that school is not for them. Or the way you talk about your curriculum or your ideal graduate, people will just sort of by default opt themselves out, and therefore your lottery pool isn't diverse. And so even if the lottery system is perfectly by the books, if you aren't populating that lottery pool with a diverse group of students, then you aren't going to get a diverse group of students in your school. So certainly it's, a system-wide problem. And I think that it'll be interesting to actually dig in and look at some of the data on some of the schools, but also just know that, it's very much on our radar to try to coach people into making good choices. Unfortunately, I think our systems to kind of check and balance that only go so far. So I don't know. Nick, any other thoughts? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you know a lot about this.
Great questions. Love this. This is always like completely worth my evening. And you borderline get me all fired up because especially if you want to bring up equity. I mean, I think our state, as you know, I'm sure you've read the most recent news, and Wisconsin is the worst in the nation for our equity numbers, especially for children of color and their performance. And our state capital is the worst district in Wisconsin. So it's we need change in terms of that. And I think what's happening more in the last year, whether this is the data, and this is why it's such a good question, Amy, because I don't know if the data necessarily will show this, and that's why I'd love to pull it together with you. But there's lots of community groups that want to start charter schools right now for subgroups. Mainly for people of color, because their needs are not being met in some of our larger communities, some of our larger urban areas in our state. I'm all for trying to work on the equity, but I love that you want to bring that up. There isn't necessarily this like, if you charter, they will do better. Some of our highest performing schools in our state are charter schools. We also have some charter schools in our state that are very low performing. Right. And so it really does depend on that governance board and that principal and that leader and how focused they are on that mission and vision. And not necessarily, this is one piece of data that we will discover. It's not necessarily based on the makeup of the school always. It really does come down to leadership. And I'm sure in your district and your board, you understand that. So I would like to dig into your individual data, and I don't know a lot about the current charter. If that is even a reason why they're chartering. I don't know that background, just because they're not a current charter school or a subgrantee with us. But that is interesting to just sort of look at that sub data. Some of our inner urban charter schools are doing very well, and they're probably more minority in some of our urban areas, and some of our suburban, it looks the opposite in some of our charters. I think when we look at that data, but let's prove it in your area. I think with the lottery policy, again, it has to be open to the public. The actual lottery needs to be open to the public, and all families can be in the lottery and watch it happen. And so that really should, that's a piece of it. Their process needs to be public as well. The only preferences that are allowed in our state for lottery are if you're a sibling of someone that already goes to that school, you get preference. If you're a student who went to that school in the previous year, you get preference. And those two are actually non-negotiable in our state. You can't not do that, right? I mean, you have to provide that. They don't have
Unless you don't have room for the sibling.
Right. The family doesn't have to go, but you have to provide that, right? You can't just, oh, that's a preference you can give. No, it's by law you have to. Mm-hmm. And the last one that is a choice that can be a preference is you can have children of board members or staff up to 10% of the population of students can have preference. Otherwise, there are no preferences allowed in our state. That's not the same in other states. As if you dig into charter law, there's lots of things. So just be careful whenever you pull up national data and whenever you pull up national articles, because our charter law is unique to Wisconsin, and it's different. It's very different in other states. Other states tend to be a bit more divisive than we do. We typically are working with communities. It's not 100% of the case. Our charters are. Our charters are not for profit. You can be for profit in other states, right? So there's some things that would be that. Now, when we think about disciplinary data, because I heard about that, yes, they can expel a student just like your school district could, but they do need to have a policy that they're following. They need to have a hearing just as your school district would do that needs to be recorded. They need to present that to DPI just like your school district does. They need to fill out a report, right? And all of that is open record, and that needs to be processed just like it would be at your school district. So for some reason, if we did have a large amount of expulsions or removals from a school, DPI would be looking into that, as well as I hope your community would be looking into that. Coaching out can happen. And what we see in a lot of our charter schools is in our state is it typically happens the other way. What we see a lot of our especially in the area of special education, and I know the data will prove this in almost any community that I look at, is that our charter schools in our state tend to have a higher level of students with special education because their families have been coached out of traditional schools that we don't know how to meet them, and the local charter school says they do. I'm not saying that they do, but they feel like they do in that area. So, but it is against the law to coach out, whether you're a charter school or a school district. You cannot tell a family that we can't serve you. If you're a district instrumentality school, charter, or an independent charter, you are not allowed to tell the family we don't have those services. You can't go to school here. Now, an IEP team would make those decisions, and or like a behavior intervention specialist, if a student is in a different, will make some of those decisions, and maybe that group decides that somewhere else is a better fit, and that is every right of an IEP team. But it is against the law for any charter school to be doing that, and that is all public record. Except for specific names of students, but percentages and totals are not are public record.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your passion, and the good news is that Madison just hired Dr. Jenkins, so they are in great hands.
Yes, that's going to be great. Thank you for that note of positivity. I like that. Yes. We are excited.
There's truth, right? But then we always have hope and love too. So I mean, and we have to hope that it's gonna that we as a state are gonna do better, because I know we can. Yeah.
All right, John has the next question.
Actually, mine kind of piggybacks off of Amy's, and that comes down to, and first of all, thank you for your presentation. Sarah, I remember meeting you before, and I heard the presentation before, so it was a good refresher for me.
I tried to update it for you,
John. The question I have for you, like I said, it piggybacks off of Amy's comments in the lottery. And Nick, you were talking about the coaching out and all of that, and I know that everything is supposed to be above board and all of that, and we hope that it is. But is there there's funding that goes along with each child, and you would put it on there, and roughly let's call it $9,000 is attached with every child that is within whichever district they go to. At what point in the year is that number solidified, whereby if suddenly that child moves and they decide to go back to a different school at that point, what is the timeline is when that happens, or when they're included in that school, whether it be the district or the charter school receives the funding?
Oh, sorry if I have feedback. I am not 100% sure, but my best guess is that they do the counts in September, in January, and maybe one in spring too. And so then the funding, just like funding goes to the LEA, it goes, they're their own LEA. So they get those kind of chunks of funding throughout the year. I think that their first payment happens very early in the year, possibly at the end of August or early September of the year that they're operating, based on their estimated enrollment. And then it gets corrected throughout the year based on their actual count days, like that third Friday count and then the January count. And so, yeah, I guess if a kid left on the second day, or no, on like the day after the third Friday count in September, they would have been counted with the independently authorized charter. But then on the next count, it would be corrected and they would be back in their district's count. But Dan or Nick, you may know this better than I do. So just in how that money comes from the state.
So with like a Mars number, like a data, like every student has a number attached to them, and they have to be enrolled somewhere else and then unenrolled somewhere, right? So whoever your coordinator is in your district, when they enroll someone, they unenroll them somewhere else. Now, after 10 days of not being there or whatever, they would have to unenroll them. And it's all an average daily membership. So you have like basically all days is 100%, and then it's just a fraction of how long that they've been there. How it works out in the wash on how soon your district would get it when they come back is, man, I don't know how much you know about school finance, but it's like it's like a PhD program in itself, right? I mean, it's absolutely crazy. I don't know who does that. But where that goes is, yes, your district would get that money, right? Let's say a kid was at 65% here and now they're 35% back in your district. You would get that 35, how quickly that comes. And where a charter school can, and this would be advice for them, where they can really get nailed is, sure, they can predict that I'm going to have 250 kids and they'll receive that first payment accordingly, right? But it will be adjusted throughout the year when they actually are turning in their enrollments, that average daily membership comes out, and they will not get a very large payment at the end, and they can really kind of, they can really get caught off guard, especially if they're a newer charter school that does not have a large fund balance or can't make up some of that district that maybe a district could, right? I mean, you're just a larger ship that one or two kids doesn't swing you. So yeah, they would start to get that payment. They would get a percentage of that $9,000 if that's what we're calling it, and then that would go back to your local. One thing that that I'm sure you caught in that diagram, but I do think it's worth bringing up again, is when you're thinking about how much money a student, is receiving when you're looking at it through that lens of a business office at any charter school or a district. A district does receive more money, right, for a student than that $8,900. And so a lot of times we have communities that want to be a district instrumentality charter school because you get the full allotment of that money. And it can work better in that arrangement with the school district and that charter school. In that contract, you can actualize the money that each student is deservingly so should be receiving. And so that's something that is kind of lost in that chart, but it's a takeaway for a lot of people that look at that, is that they know when they punch the numbers that their state revenue, their local tax levy amount tends to be more than that $8,900. Not all, but a lot of districts tend to be.
Yeah, some of them are considerably higher, and so then it really becomes quite a conversation, when kind of looking for authorizers because of that difference and kind of that 9,000 average or, number that's set by the state.
Which is also just unique. I did a lot of work in Minnesota too. Wisconsin is very unique in terms of we don't fund independent schools very much. Our charter schools are not funded like they are in other states. So there are a lot of people, I'll be honest, that when they try to put their budget together, making an independent charter school work, especially for a small amount of kids, is a very, very big challenge at only $8,900 a student.
Just to, I guess, to finish off that question, if a student comes in to the district, whichever district, and they're there for 1 month, okay, or maybe even less. So at that point, they're already counted in that district, and that district is going to get that first paycheck for that first allotment for that child. But if for whatever reason they suddenly that district says, you know, we can't meet your needs in our district, I think that you should go back to this other district next door. That district then is going to be taken on that child, but they're not going to receive any payment until the next term. Is that correct?
Well, they wouldn't start receiving any payment for that particular child until whenever that payment cycle goes in, right? Yeah, you're right.
But you were saying that the payment gets corrected along the way, and that you do get paid for that time. You just don't receive it until later. So say that the payments happen in like September and January, and you've had the kid in November and December, you'd still get November and December kind of percentage. It just wouldn't arrive until the January payment.
So cash flow in schools is crazy, just because you don't receive your money when someone buys the burger, right? It doesn't look like that. And so it is really advantageous to have a base of money so that your cash flow can pay the teacher's salaries when some of this can be happening. At the end of the year is the best way to look at it, John. At the end of the year, you would get 45%, right? And that other school gets 55%, and it just gets worked out throughout the year and what that funding looks like. Your budgeting, right, in your district probably does this to some level. You're looking at what our projected enrollment was in our district. This is where our dollars, and it could have a dramatic change, especially in the world of COVID right now. This is a big struggle with a lot of our districts is trying to have that projected number. And then you kind of have that does change. And we call it like it's an ADM is sort of like our average daily membership. And then there's another like term where we use the word WATM, which is sort of our predicted number. And so the cash flow is sort of the variable. Depending on when you get your payments from the state, it's not clean. But you're right. The way to look at it is by the end of the year, it does all come out in the wash. But we might be $385 off for a little while, or whatever that looks like.
I will say. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go.
Joanne, when are the dates that DPI cuts the district's checks?
There are various for our aid payments, but they are completely based on our third Friday count in September and our January counts. And so when we're reporting that difference at those two periods, that's where we're seeing an adjustment. But we aren't reporting an average daily attendance or membership each month. So I guess I'm a little confused on how you think that we're getting that allotment back or forth, because it's an adjustment. If they're in our district in September and not in our district, or vice versa in January, we're getting an adjustment at that point of you're not going to get your full year, you half year, but it isn't necessarily adjusted by month, because we're not saying, oh, they were here until June, or they were here until October. When they were there in September and they're not there in January, it's an adjustment at that point. And all of our state aids and our categorical per pupils, they are paid in 4 payments from the state. So we are getting those divvied out across the year, with the last payment, of course, coming in August, which is actually last year's revenue. So, and Beloit is unique in this fact with the, just to remind our board as well, Beloit's already in a declining enrollment situation. So that's a natural decline enrollment. And when you have this projected secondary decline of a charter school opening up, that is just compounding our declining enrollment and how that impacts. So the data that I provided as far as what those numbers and things look like, That truly, I want to remind all of the board members, this is truly just if we took today's scenario. However, I did use the anticipated cost for charter schools. They keep talking about 8,900. Cassandra at the Resource Center and DPI had confirmed right now they're estimating it at 9,165 for next year. So I was using that number to clarify what you guys have versus what they're referring to. Okay. So I use that rate, but talking about just generalized what we receive for students and what I'm predicting as our per pupil on our revenue limit, and taking that, but you're not going to see that whole 700 kids or 10% or whatever at one time. So I just want to make sure that the board understands that difference in what we're communicating.
Thank you, Joanne. That's super helpful. And yeah, like I said, it kind of bumps up a 100 or 200 each year for that kind of state determined amount. And so by the time Lincoln Academy opens, their amount may be different yet, and so that 9,165 again is just sort of like, say it's 9,000 or whatever, however you want to calculate it, but it may be a little different yet.
Right. You're going to see approximately for the board, you're going to see about 233 student decline over 3 years for that change that we would see at that one time is what you were expecting. You'll see that 233 every year. And by year 4, you're going to see that full effect of that 700 plus what our natural decline is. If we continue to have decline on top of that, I gave you a very, very broad, just that picture of what we're looking at today. So I want to be really clear that don't take those numbers that you were provided as this is exactly what's going to happen. That is in a scenario as we see it today, just as an overview. That is not how it's going to necessarily play out as we continue to see the process. This will be very fluid, as Sarah has indicated. And as we all know, school finance and state funding is completely up in the air right now with COVID and how we're all going to recover and do that. So be very cautious in just looking at those numbers, that they could result in drastically different changes from that side.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask just a couple of questions, and maybe for the board or Joy, this when you said that the 233 or and then it was going to get up to a 700, those kids are leaving and they're going. That's the anticipated enrollment at the charter school.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. The Lincoln Academy has proposed that they will take 10% of our students, which is almost 700 students.
Okay, and so. So 700 of your students. Okay. And so that would be one question that I just sort of have, and you don't have to answer that, but one question I would have if I was working with you all in charters, I would say, why would they all go there? That would be one question. And then the second question, because that's a lot of students, right? And then the second would be, you'd have a declining enrollment. What's the root cause of that? Is that age of your folks? Is that people are moving out of Beloit? People have gone on to virtual. What's the rationale for declining enrollment?
And that might be a somewhat, maybe a question we need to discuss another time.
Those are
yes. But you're right. I mean, going back to our needs assessment slide, like that's exactly kind of, the conversation that we have with districts is like, okay, what's going on if declining enrollment is an issue, if you feel like kids are drawn to other schools outside of your school district, how do we, not necessarily to compete, but just to say, like Megan was bringing up, that you offer a lot of those things in Beloit. And so is that all clearly articulated to your families and kind of marketed is, not the greatest word, but sort of, presented in a way that families know that they have these choices within the district as well as choices outside of the district. And, with COVID and everything, I know you've been having conversations around how you're serving kids remotely for families who don't feel safe coming back to your buildings and things like that. So just being able to articulate, that families aren't going all to open enroll and sign up for virtual schools that enroll kids from all around the state, because you're able to offer, a high quality virtual option for them within the district. And so in that kind of same light, that's the kind of exercise that we go through with districts who are feeling these challenges and seeing the phenomenon of kids leaving their district. How do you, and maybe it's through your own charter, opportunities, and maybe not, but how do you kind of present what you have, focus on the things that make you special as a district, and then present those in that same way. And, we have a number of districts who do a really great job talking about their portfolio, and kind of going back to like the very first slide that I presented, where I showed, that districts have programs within their districts that they can sort of articulate and kids can opt into, and there is a lot of choice and opportunity within a school district. So maybe that's for another board workshop where we kind of think through some of that stuff, and really dig in, like you had mentioned earlier in the call, Kyle, like what would that application look like, and what kinds of schools would we even entertain, and how would we be as an authorizer? There's certainly a lot we can dive into there another time.
Does anyone else have a first question? I guess it'd be Stephanie, before we kind of go around for round two.
Sorry, I was having a hard time unmuting. Did I have a question?
Yeah, do you have a question? Do you have a first question before we go around for more?
No, I do not. I'm getting my answers already. Thank you.
Oh, okay, perfect. My next question is would anybody be in favor of just taking a 5-minute break, or are people meeting their needs as necessary?
Sarah, do you and Nick need a little break?
I think it'd be good. I'd like to just fill up my water and stuff. So if that's okay for the board meeting, can we just take like 2 or 3 minutes?
Yeah. So
awesome.
7:40.
Sounds great. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep, scene 5. If we're ready to go, Dan had another question.
Great.
Yeah, thank you again, Sarah and Nick. I appreciate the conversation that you are having with us. And I guess mine is, and I appreciate the questions that the board members are asking because they're along the same lines that I have. So it's more of a comment at this point. But going kind of back to the lottery question that Amy was talking about, because and Nick, you kind of touched upon this a little bit in the fact that it's one thing to say what you do on paper. It's a whole different thing when it goes into practice, because as you had shared, how you market the process for applications and how the hoops that are placed for families to get the applications significantly changes the pool but from which the names are being drawn from. So you already inherently create a system that perpetuates inequities when the jar that you're pulling the names out of, you already know the makeup of the jar, right? So if you have 100 names in there and 85 of them are of one identity, the probability that diverse populations come out significantly goes down. That's the math, right? So my comment is, certainly if you just localize it to Wisconsin, there is negative perceptions and significant challenges, both not only on the lottery side, but the conversation we were just having on the funding side, where and granted, some of the news articles are perhaps locally regionalized, but they're the challenges and perceptions nonetheless of how the people who are putting charter schools, and not all people, but some people are abusing the statutes to benefit a small number of people and a small group of people who are helping to put the charter schools together. So from your standpoint, is there proactive measures that your organization or other organizations are out there to help districts, educate communities, educate the people who are supporting these charter schools, so that there are some quality controls and assurances over and above the accountability measures that you talked about to promote equity if this exists in our ecosystem, and it does, and put some safeguards so that our children and our families aren't being victimized repeatedly as they try to find options that are best for them. And again, that's a big unpacking. It's more of a comment, but I like your reactions from that.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, certainly we see it. We've put energy into it. We continue to put energy into it, but unfortunately, Nick and I serve in a role that is a resource center. And so we are very limited in our ability to actually force anything to happen or enact safeguards, like you said, or, put procedures in place, because all we can do is help educate, help inform, help make things possible, help make the process easier. And yes, to be really forthcoming with saying, hey, here's 12 questions that your governance board should consider around equity. Have you done DPI's Promoting Excellence for All training? Every single subgrantee is required to go through that course with their team. They aren't necessarily required to do anything with the information that they acquire. But again, it's a resource, and just making all of those practices as publicly known and easily accessible as possible, so that it's not hard for a governance board to have those conversations, because we have guides for them, and we'll come in and do it with them and for them, but we can't change anyone's practice. Just like, with authorizers too. I mean, I could go around and tell authorizers what kinds of charter schools would make the most sense, and are your charter schools truly serving educationally disadvantaged students and filling articulated needs? But you don't have to. You can authorize the school for any old reason, and so it really is. And I don't mean to keep not answering your questions, but yes, I mean, I think Nick and I are trying really hard, but our standpoint in the grand scheme of things is not a powerful one, powerful in the way that we can, right. Things happen. We can strongly encourage things to happen.
No, and I appreciate that the answers that you've been giving, and I guess more so if there are organizations or things that you know of that are being formed or developed or things like that, and I absolutely get what you're saying in terms of as a school district, we are a microcosm of our community, and so we have our own branding and marketing and all of that, and that dynamic changes with this piece. And so I appreciate the education and information you're giving us to help better support the work that we're doing within our community and supporting our families. So
I guess I would add a piece, and this is probably way off maybe where you're going, but welcome to working with me. And I think about this just as I told my two daughters that are going to bed, and I'm thinking about this and telling them, like, who are you talking to, Dad? And I'm talking to people down south. And what are we talking about? Like, we're talking about like trying to make sure that every single kid in our community reaches their full human potential, right? I mean, that's what we do. So I guess part of my work would be, at least what I would feel is, can you still reach out to these folks? Because it feels really divisive. And this is just a feeling that I'm getting. I could be completely off here. But I know charter schools are divisive, so maybe that's why I've got that feeling. It's not the first time that we've been in that situation. But how do we put positions aside and names and how do we just start focusing on the interests of kids? And how do we still leverage if there's a group of people in our community, whether we see eye to eye on them on everything and our positions, but I'm sure at the end of the day, we do actually want kids to be successful. How do we use those groups to leverage and make our whole community stronger? Whether they're an independent charter school or we decide to authorize them and they're part of our district, how do we just somehow play nice in the sandbox? But more than that, we can't play. These are kids' lives, right? In 12 years, our kindergartners are in college, hopefully, right? And that we know those 12 years fly by. So I guess part of it would be reaching out, and that's not always easy, but just to say, hey, what can we do? We don't want to read about your policies. We want to help work with you to say, how do we find the right kids for your program or your school? How do you let us know, how can we work together? How can we learn from your special education staff? How does our special education staff help inform you? I mean, all kids are our kids. And I think you guys probably treat that way even with districts, except when we're playing Friday night football. How do we make sure that all kids are our kids? Otherwise the tide is not going to rise all boats, right? And that's I think what. And it doesn't sound like it's too late, right? It sounds like they're not, ground hasn't been broken, doors aren't open. How do we make sure before it's too late? I wish we would have reached our hand across the aisle.
I appreciate that.
Okay, Megan has her next question.
I so appreciate everything that you just said. And it was I swear I didn't pay you down. This you just set up my whole question for me. So thank you. So if you don't mind, I'd love to address, since I've personally asked the folks at Kids First to come to a public board meeting. I think formally now 3 times, and no one has decided to come yet. I really do sincerely appreciate what you're saying here about reaching across the aisle. So my question has to do with autonomy and charters. And the reason I'm asking is because as this is my 2nd year on school board, I ran for the school board because I believe sincerely what you just said, that all Beloit children are our children. We have a lot of we have a lot of barriers to success in our community that I wholeheartedly believe that our board and our community to work together to remove for all of these children. And I find that it's going to be increasingly difficult to do that as resources are removed from our school district to remove those barriers. So if I were not on school board and I wanted to create a school or a mechanism to rise the tide to lift all boats in the community, I would probably go to the school district first. And sadly, there's never been, I mean, Sarah said it herself earlier with the drink and the handshake comment, there was never a public or even an attempt that all board members were made aware of until far after the fact for there to be any actual like authentic discussion or any discussion at all about any kind of partnership. Like it just never happened. I know that there have been claims that it happened. It happened with, I think, a handful of people, but since I wasn't there and was never made aware of it until after the fact, and since it was never done in a public forum for our community, we don't really know, right? So I guess I'm making that point to say that if I were in that position, I would want to keep those funds and I would want to take what we have and like build something better for our kids. And so my question is there anything at all stopping any group of people who wanted to, I believe in their application, they talked about having a different schedule, different calendar, different curriculum. Couldn't we as a school district authorize an instrumentality charter school to give them all of the autonomy that they want, short of, I realize that it's short of hiring their own people, but I want to come back to that point in a moment. Isn't that though, aren't they able to put all of that autonomy and those desires into an instrumentality charter?
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. Okay, so my second question then is like, knowing what I think all of us in this room are aware of, that there is a shortage of qualified educators, particularly in, we call them like the high demand fields. What is the wisdom of doing a non-instrumentality or an independent charter where you're going to further divide teaching teachers, qualified teachers in our own community? And I'll just I'm sorry I talk so much. I'm not really sorry I talk so much because then I would like actually stop. So that's like a fake sorry, but I'll just quickly make the point that the reputation that a lot of these charter schools have, particularly the one in Milwaukee where they're bringing their curriculum and their practices from, have a lot of first year teachers or teachers who aren't necessarily qualified or like are getting their qualifications through Teach for America, which fine program as that is not the same as having like a highly qualified teacher. So can you tell me from your perspective as a resource center, what is kind of like the wisdom of doing a non-instrumentality because of the teacher shortage, or why, I guess like if you have a school board that's willing to cooperate, why would you even need to do an independent charter school? Could you speak to that a bit?
Sure. Yes. And I want to, again, like not get too tangential here. So steer me back if I go.
Okay. I don't need to that. You go for it.
Yeah. So I guess going back to the first thing that you were saying is absolutely. I mean, at any point, your school board could put out, a call for applications, could review an application from any school, whether it's a school that already exists or a school that's in the planning year or a school that's a brand new idea of staff for, anyone. And you get to develop what that application process looks like, all the policies and everything like that, what the autonomies would be, what the accountabilities would be. It's a good process to go through, even if you're just sort of pondering it, and it wouldn't commit you to anything, but it allows you the opportunity to openly and publicly say that we as the school district, board of Beloit want to seek charter school applications for district authorized charter schools in Beloit. And at that point, you could review the application of the school that's already in planning. And you could even, sometimes we've seen schools change authorizers. And so even schools that are already open sometimes change authorizers midway through their life. And certainly I think, given sort of the bits and pieces that I know about your situation, it seems like if you did have a process in place and you were seeking applications for review and your board wanted to go through that process with the Lincoln Academy, I think at this point, or, at any point in their future, certainly it's worth pursuing and seeing if they would be interested in having that kind of going through that process with you. I think that part of what you would need to do in setting up that process, well, it's a whole number of things like my slides alluded to earlier. You can talk about your vision and your process and all of those things. But part of, I think, past conversations, and John, I'm remembering back, it must have been almost a year ago, the first time that we had that meeting with the group that is now, I think, at least part of the board of Lincoln Academy. There were conversations about, well, what's the difference between the instrumentality and non-instrumentality? And as a district of Beloit, are we interested in having non-instrumentalities, or are we only interested in instrumentalities? And so I remember there were a lot of conversations early on around that. And so that's something as a board that you would need to decide, would you entertain authorizing a school that had the non-instrumentality component, because not all districts do. And so certainly that limits your applicant pool. Again, going back to applicant pool, if you're setting up and putting out there that you're only interested in a certain kind of school. Some authorizers are only interested in elementary charter schools. Some are only interested in environmental charter schools or STEM or whatever it is. And so, you as an authorizer can decide that. And so then if Lincoln Academy fit what you were putting out as in your solicitation of applications, then, potentially they could apply to be authorized by you, and then you would review it and then eventually go through a contracting process to make them officially an authorized school. So that's kind of the first part of your question, is just like, could you? Yes, absolutely. And then the why around the staffing, I think schools do it for different reasons. I mean, a good example is if you're like a Waldorf school or Montessori school that has a really strict licensure program that requires not just a general sort of teacher license for most institutions, but an additional one. The schools often wish to become non-instrumentalities or be independently authorized because they want to ensure that their staff have that appropriate training, and that there would never be a case where there are teacher shortages within the district as a whole, and somebody gets sort of placed there just because of class size reductions and this and that, and all of a sudden you've got someone who doesn't know anything about Waldorf and doesn't like Waldorf is now in a Waldorf classroom, and that wouldn't really help the school. And so again, it's like, yes, you don't really need that protection of the charter school, but it just like adds that one more layer of sort of assurance that you're going to end up with teachers who really believe in it. And so I don't know if that's the reason for the Lincoln Academy. I think there's probably other reasons too, but I think that kind of vision alignment is certainly one that I see often.
Well, I really appreciate that, and that makes sense. And I do just want to make sure that, and it was kind of personally responding to Nick and his comments, I know our whole board very much wholeheartedly believes in the potential of all of our Beloit kids. And, we're all part of the value of having you both here tonight, which again, thank you, is just making sure that we have all the knowledge about like how we could potentially, utilize our own in-district charter school to provide alternative education opportunities for diverse learners, which is a wonderful thing that I think there are people who would like to explore. But I also, I really think it's important for our community to hear and to understand that like the way that the Lincoln Academy is choosing to go forward is not the only way that they could. And Nick, like you said, it would be great if there could have been maybe more partnership. And certainly, I believe since all of us were willing to have had them here this evening as an agenda item to do kind of like a discussion, I believe that support is here because, we do value our community and what's best for all of our kids as a board. But I'll go, I think, John, you had a question?
Actually, I got several, but I'm going to leave it at one right now. And I'm going to kind of shift gears because I want to make sure some of the stuff is covered. One of my concerns that I have, and I think it's shared by many, is fairness across the board as far as, what's available, what we have available for students, and what other districts might have available. And I think that, we've gone, and I'm specifically pointing towards AP coursework and extracurricular activities. And with other districts and we've seen co-ops that we've had with other districts before. We've had other situations where, students have had, they moved into our district. How does that apply with a charter school and under current legislation? And is there any talk or any discussion about how that potentially could change in the future? And so what I'm getting at is it possible for a student to go to an outside, let's say they're homeschooled, and then can they say, well, I want to take an AP course at the high school, and would they have that ability to do that? Or could they say, I want to be part of your jazz band, even though I don't go to school at your school, but I want to be a part of your jazz band because I live in the city. Is that an option?
I knew you guys were going to ask this because when I was there, Megan, remember like a few months ago with my guy from the School Board Association, we both were like, and so I mean, I'm learning slowly. I think a lot of it depends on WIAA for all the like athletics type stuff because, and kind of what their policies allow for co-ops and things like that. So I want to try to think through your different examples. So you're wondering if somebody who's like a homeschooler, and I know this was just one of your examples, but like a homeschooler would be able to do jazz band at Lincoln Academy. Was that the question? Or
No, they would, let's say that they were homeschooled and they wanted to be part of our jazz band at the high school.
At Beloit.
At Beloit, yes. I mean, is that an option that they would have available to say, yes, they have that right to do that, you have to offer that out to them? Or they were at Lincoln Academy and they wanted to take an AP Calc class. Would we have to grant them that right?
Each one has a different answer. And Dan, you look like you maybe know some of this, but I remember going back and forth with Mike Bormet, and he's like, well, if you're open enrolled, then it's this. And if you're homeschooled, then it's this. And if you're at a neighboring district or if it's a private school, and some of it depends on the district, some of it depends on WIAA, and some of it's just a no. And so I don't know, Dan, if you have more clarity, that would be good too.
So the WIAA, I will willfully say that I do not know because it's all over the place, and athletic directors have a special place to keep all that straight in their head. But when it comes to the programming and so forth, and this takes us a little bit back in history, because that history may be coming back again. So think back to a few years ago when we used to have what we called course options and youth options. So course options allowed any student K-12 to take up to 2 classes at a time at other school districts or higher ed institutions, and there were limits placed on what the tuition cost and all of that could be. That was eliminated in the last biennium budget, and we went back to part-time open enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's talk and conversations at the state level. It hasn't passed yet, but there's a push to make course options come back with a little bit of a caveat in that it is first grade through 12th grade. And there would be basically an interdistrict transfer of funds. We would, in the past, under the old course options, the school district determined what that tuition would be. So to use rough numbers, let's say if we have a student that comes to the school district and they don't have a tuition waiver or anything like that, and we charge them $6,000 and they take 6 classes for full-time credit. So you take 2 classes, it's $1,000 per credit, you charge it to the school district. now under the current legislation that hasn't passed, there's a formula to be determined by DPI. So there would be some sort of exchange. And my understanding is that it is any student. It doesn't necessarily have to be a student coming from a public school. So the way I interpret the intention is a homeschooled student or a student at a charter school could come and say, I want to take band or I want to take an AP class, and we would have if we have space for them, we as a board we would make a vote to say, yep, we can do this. Now, generally in current statute, every year we have to allot by grade level how many open seats we would have. So if as a board we would say we had no open seats at any grade level, we automatically give myself the authority to say we just have no open seats. We would automatically deny any part-time open roll requests or course option requests. However, if we were to say that we have 10 seats at the high school level, we don't get to pick and choose which 10 applications. It's basically first come, first serve. So we would have the 10 applications, the first 10 applications that come through the door would, if we have that stipulated, we would do that. And so that's a simplified version of how it goes. There's a whole lot of background pieces to it, but it is an agreement in terms of the parent making the request and the school district saying that there's spaces available and coming back.
Thank you. I'm reading the statute here.
Yeah.
Yeah, Peg, if you want to, can you jump in and just read that? I want to try to, we can use the chat box, but I want to try to read what's in there too out loud for our viewers at home.
Yes, please jump in.
Okay, I sure can. This is directly from the DPI website in their FAQs, Wisconsin State Statute 118.53. Homeschooled students may attend a public school on a part-time basis. A school district is required, space permitting, to allow pupils who are enrolled in a homeschool program to take up to 2 courses per semester at any public schools. Students must satisfy the minimum standards for admission to a course offered by the school district.
Oh, this is bringing me back now too, because when we had the school board association guy and we were kind of putting it together, part of, and in the conversations with DPI, a lot of times students would open and roll out and then open and roll back into their home district for certain things. And oftentimes it's if they open and roll out into a virtual school, but then they want to open and roll back in for band or something like that. And so that's where that part-time open enrollment, and there's a lot of them. And so I think DPI, maybe Dan is proposing this because it's gotten to a point where there's so many kids, open enrolling out and in and out, and, but and then homeschooling is different because you don't open enroll to homeschooling, and independently authorized charter schools are different because you don't open enroll into them. So you can't part-time open enroll back in because you never open enrolled out. You are enrolled in a different school, but you're not open enrolled like capital O, capital E. And so you don't have that ability, I think, to open enroll back in. Now the district could set a policy where they allow it, I think, but it's not an obligation is what I'm remembering, but please look it up because I am not certain, but I have a hunch that that's how it was. And then with the WIAA stuff, that was almost, I think it was totally up to you that if you chose to co-op in football but not in baseball, that was totally your choice. If there were students at the Lincoln Academy that that wanted to be on some of your teams, you can just do all of those individual contracts with the school through those WIA co-ops. But I don't think you're obligated.
Yeah, you're and I'll trust you on the WIA stuff, but the convoluted nature of programming when it comes to homeschooling, charters, and so forth. In part, you are absolutely right, Sarah, that when course options was around, that was a lever for primarily the virtual charter schools. A student was a part of a virtual charter school, say in Rhinelander, but wanted to take band or choir or something that wasn't offered. They had that option when it was taken away, the part-time open enrollment. The biggest thing is that there was a form that was filled out, and it had to really come from, under the course options, a family-driven process. Part-time open enrollment is an entity-driven process. So the family requests of the entity that I want to take a course here, and then it's becomes a decision-making process between the two. Mm-hmm. And then homeschool, like you said, is a whole different third can. So thank you, Peg, for sharing that. And if you have other context to that, feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah. And I think, it's just going to be a learning process because like Dan said, it's bound to change again in the next 2 years before Lincoln Academy opens, or 15 months, and so, and then just, it may not present itself as much of an issue, especially if they are starting with younger kids, until those kids start to be older, and then the extracurriculars and the APs, start to come into play more. And by that time, things will probably have changed again. And so, we'll just need to stay tuned and check with DPI as those cases arise.
Okay. Spencer's not able to be with us tonight, but he did email me a couple of questions. If I can ask those for him, please. So one of his questions is that since charter schools receive public funding, does the public have a say in how they spend their money? So, is there a way for public input or not really?
The governance board meetings where the budgets would be discussed and approved are open meetings. There would be periods of public comment, so certainly voices can be heard, and all of that agendas would be posted, and minutes would be posted. So, and governance boards are required to approve budgets. So certainly it would be transparent in that way. And, potentially a person could have their voice heard. But as far as, having a role in the accountability of those funds and things, I think that's more limited.
Okay.
Yeah. They can sort of keep an eye on the authorizing board and office and what's going on there, what's in the contract, what's, how all that funding is being allocated to the school and stuff like that. But it's, they don't have like a direct, the public doesn't get to vote on the school's expenditures. Yeah.
So, and then how in an independent charter school is the governance board selected, or who chooses? Does somebody appoint? Is there some sort of an election?
Yeah, it's determined by their bylaws. So each one is structured a little bit differently, the length of terms, the number of members. Generally, I would say there is a range. So they'll say, we have 5 to 11 members or something. That's maybe kind of a generous range, but I would say that's the ballpark for where most of our governance boards are. They establish themselves as an entity with the founding board, which generally stems out of the design team as kind of an organic assembly of people who establish the organization. And then from there, they follow the bylaws. And so there's a process out there when you're establishing an organization on how to do that and how to have that first meeting and your initial membership. And then after that, generally, they have 2-year terms and people can only, have so many terms and stuff like that. But each governance board's bylaws are personalized to kind of their school. Typically, they include a certain number of community members, a certain number of parents or potential parents for the school or alumni. They could include, specifically someone who knows the trade if the school or like the focus area of the school. So if it's like a manufacturing and STEM or engineering type school, they might maintain that at least one person on their governance board has that expertise. And then beyond that, we have, like I said, we have all sorts of resources for boards on what is best practice and what types of people you should be looking for on boards and how to, go about your election process. And generally there's an annual meeting. They post that elections will be had. Now, there's a form for nominating people and stuff like that. But like I said, that's a bit of a generality because each one's bylaws are unique.
Okay, thank you. And then one last question that Spencer had, and I think you already answered it, but I just want to make sure. So even with an independent charter school, because they are a public school, they do have to have their governance board meetings have to be noticed. They have to follow all of those open meeting laws, right?
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you. That's all Spencer had.
Yeah, and their minutes should be posted as well. Their minutes in proper after they've been approved. Their minutes need to be posted, very similar to your process. And I always encourage community members with independence, like by all means, they'll have a process for how they want to recruit board members because we spend a lot of time with recruitment. I highly encourage your community to get into that process. I would say 95% of our charter school boards are struggling to find good people. Okay. It's not the other way around. They have so many people they want in and they're just picking and choosing. It's usually the other way around, especially in our smaller communities because there's only so many people. Sorry, Jeff.
I had a question for Sarah. Sarah, you had said election. And I guess I just don't want anybody to be confused or me to be confused. I mean, they don't actually have an election for their board members, do they? I mean, they have a process that they go through, but it's pretty much appointed, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an election like a public ballot election, but it's an election in that you seek nominations. Typically, I remember, some schools sort of have a form and you fill out, what your strengths are, what you're bringing to the board, why you want to be on the board, that sort of thing, like an application. And then the standing board would take votes on voting in new members, just as a nonprofit. I mean, they're typically a nonprofit board. And so just as you would think of other nonprofit boards in your community, that's generally how it works. A certain number of people's terms are up or they resign at some point. And then, the seats are posted, which ones are available. If there's a parent seat available and a community member seat available, and, when those seats will be filled, typically, they post it 1 month or 2 months out, and then they have a deadline for nominees. And then at a public meeting, the board votes in new members based on that applicant pool. So it's somewhere, I think, John, maybe between an appointed position and an election, and that there is a vote, there is some public transparency to it, but it's not the same as, a school board election. And it's not as sort of under the table, I think, as you might be imagining if you say an appointed position.
But that should be listed in their bylaws you had mentioned before. So it should be clear there. And then also there's no requirements that they have to fill. Is that correct? I mean, they don't have it. You have to have parents. You have to have, certain individuals from the community. I mean, there's no requirements, correct?
Well, it depends what they put in their bylaws. I mean, so a board could have 3 people and they could be any random 3 people. They don't have to say that it needs to be this, this, and that. But if they put it in their bylaws, then they're somewhat held to it as a public entity, that's the kind of board that they would fill, and at any point, I think they could vote to change that or amend it if they felt like that wasn't sustainable. But the intent would be, if you're going to have 7 members, right? I mean, and then if your bylaws say that you're going to fill them at your annual meeting every August, then that's, typically what the boards follow for procedures.
And we have had open records requests from community members as what was the process? What were how many applications did you receive? The applications became public record. So we have seen that process. I have seen an election in some schools where they determine who their membership is, and that's typically the families that are involved, and their families elect. Not again, and this is in our state, we just don't have very many competitive governance boards. So there's never lots of people that really want in, and so they're fighting for more of a membership vote. But I have seen some schools that do have a membership vote on like a community night or something like that.
That's true. I've seen that too, where they send out like a Google form to all parents, and parents just have the ability to sort of put a checkbox next to the people that they approve in, to sort of add that one more layer. And if that's what you do as your policy in your bylaws, and that's your practice as a governance board, that's good practice, but that's not necessarily what I'll do. And we also have board makeup matrices, like a matrix where you say, okay, here's all the strengths of our current board members and here's what we're looking for. And so it gives the board that opportunity to potentially not fill with their current applicants if they feel like those board members wouldn't contribute anything new to the existing, matrix of the board members. So, I mean, it varies. But I think, it tends to be, more public than just like an appointed or, sort of self-assembled board.
Thank you.
I think Megan has one more question.
I do. Thanks, folks. So on that subject of the use of the word public, so yeah, I've been a board member of our, we have a parent cooperative daycare. We follow that same thing. We have parent membership, and I understand that it is like technically an election, but what I would say the difference between like local non-for-profit boards that have elections in their membership and what we're talking about here is that we're taking like state allocated dollars for the school district of Beloit, and we're taking beyond just I understand it's called like per pupil, but this is going to speak to my question. Like it's taking beyond what the dollars that go specifically just to students. It cuts into the ancillary costs of the entire district, and we're reallocating funds that go toward the entire district to the benefit of all children to a smaller pool of children. And there's not a citywide accountability measure like a school board election where folks can be held accountable to their use of public dollars. So I understand, and I had your slide. I hope your print screened it and saved it in my notes. Like you've got where it's like, like public and it's underlined and bolded. I have a different perspective on the use of the term public for schools. And to me, this is a publicly funded school that's independently authorized by a public entity, but there is no actual public elected accountability at the local level. And I just want to clarify that to get to a local position, you'd have to go to Governor Evers, because it's the governor who appoints the Board of Regents to the UW system, who appoints a chancellor, who hires the position at UW OEO. And I also wanted to point out earlier, you had mentioned that the independent authorizer could even take an administrative fee. So some of those Beloit dollars then might be going directly to Madison. So having said all of that, I'm wondering if Sarah or Nick, if you want to speak a little bit to just to help the community understand better. And I don't know if Joanne did a really nice job, and Dr. Kieser as well, putting together kind of a Q&A. I believe it's in board docs. But if we could just talk about the difference between per pupil in the sense that there's dollars that go directly to student services directly to students versus how that $9,000 goes above and beyond what's individually allocated to each child. And I think if we had a better understanding of that, maybe we would see why, as a citizen, as a taxpayer, I'm concerned with not having local oversight for their use of tax dollars, even if within their organization they're elected. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, I think it makes sense. It's certainly a valid concern.
really the only way to sort of truly have control of that money back in the hands of your school board would be to authorize that school. Otherwise it is, somewhat out of your hands. It's a different organization overseen by another different organization. And, certainly there are ties still to Beloit, but yeah, that money is sort of not in the hands of Beloit anymore. It's moved past, and so I think you're right to have those thoughts and concerns. Yeah, I don't know that I have an answer other than to just say that I think it's valid to be concerned about that, and there isn't, like I was mentioning to Spencer's question earlier too, like there isn't a way that you're like going to be voting on that money or holding anyone accountable. You're probably not going to call Governor Evers and say, hey, I don't think that they should have bought that smart board. It's just not. So it's separated, and it just really is. I think, having ways to bring those kids back to you, whether it's through authorizing this school or a different school, or just changing some practices within Beloit, or somehow, talking about what's available in the community differently, are all strategies that don't really answer your question, but that would be sort of what we would steer people towards, is like, you can't fix that. It's not, that's what's in the statute. So, you can, think about how we can get that statute changed, or, work with DPI to, restructure maybe how some of that money is spent, but a lot of that is in the statutes too, so I think, it sort of, this is how it works. And you have you have a minimal role in how those dollars are going to be spent, and what that accountability is. Megan, you keep sort of asking, well, like, what if they're doing a really bad job, or like they're not serving our kids? And that is a possibility. I can't say that it isn't. And so you can't really control that as a Beloit school board member, because it's not part of you anymore.
No, for sure. And I appreciate your answer to that. I guess I just want our community to hear like how that works, and also just like, as that funding is removed from the district, it weakens our ability to be responsive to those demands from the community as well. But thank you so much for addressing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to is first of all, I really hope there's a way that you guys can reach out, and I really hope there's a way that you guys can have some sort of connection, so that really you're working together. I would love to go on record saying that for the most part, charter schools are better off being with their district. There are some exceptions to that, but the rule is that we typically advise communities to authorize through their district if their district is willing, and sometimes that's not the case. And then the second piece is, a lot of times in some of our independent situations, when the school's getting started, it's heated like this. And then once the school's in operation, it sort of has gone away. I really implore people to go to their board meetings and be there, and to listen and to hear, because just that presence holds schools accountable a little bit and what's being done. Because sometimes we see that sort of disappears and no one's been to a board meeting or what. But sometimes having that public comment section at a board meeting does hold some weight. It's not Governor Evers, but I do think it's valuable.
Yeah, certainly. And just, looking at data together, and like that data, from the conversation with Amy earlier, if we can pull some stuff and make it really, not to like add fuel to any tensions, but to bring conversations forward and say, okay, this is what our data situation is in Beloit. Here's what our district is choosing to do to sort of respond to that data. Here's what you're choosing to do to respond to that data. Communicating to the community, here are all the different ways that schools in your community are choosing to respond to our data, and making it sort of this holistic, that could be a reach. I mean, this is Sarah living in Rainbow Land, but I do think, going back to the, all kids are our kids, like, then let's just be really inclusive and really talk about how we're serving our kids. Now, other districts who have independently authorized charters in their geographic boundaries don't necessarily do that. I think it's much more common for districts that have district authorized charter schools to kind of present that whole portfolio approach to their community. But I think in our rural districts, I've seen the districts be really inclusive about the kind of private school options within their community. And so, it can be done where we sort of show parents, here are all of your choices, so that we're not coaching in, we're not coaching out, but we're being really transparent. And especially in this state of COVID and equity concerns and looking into our data, just more information is better. And so not hiding anything, not trying to be competitive, but to just say, here's everything. And, as you're a parent, it's hard enough to be a parent right now and navigating choices and this and that. Like, include the voucher schools. Why not include the virtual open enrollments? And you're gonna say no, and you're gonna laugh because that crazy Sarah was on your call. But really, think about, and we have some resources that we give out to parents to say, here's what all these things are. If you're looking for a choice for your kid who's struggling, you don't know that if you want to get into the neighboring district's charter school, you have to open enroll and go through a lottery. But if you want to go to the independently authorized charter school, it's just a lottery. Or if you want your kid to be in virtual school, there's 52 virtual schools in our state that you could sign up for. These are all things that it's just any information we can give to parents right now about their opportunities for their kids, I think is just so valuable. So, even if you don't, like Nick was suggesting and Megan, to work together in any kind of tangible way with this particular school, I think just imagining ways to frame public school options in general for your parents, or all school options for your parents in general, is super helpful.
Are there any other questions for Sarah and Nick? Okay. Well, I want to thank you both very much for being here with us tonight and helping us, kind of apply this knowledge towards Lincoln Academy, but then also lay that foundation for any future in-district charter schools that may come our way in the future. So thank you again very much for being here. Before we all go, Joanne, did you want to take just a quick minute to briefly talk about that financial piece that you prepared for us? You kind of touched on it earlier, but if anybody's watching at home on YouTube, like all 19 of them I saw earlier.
I was not really prepared to talk about that. I didn't know that was an expectation tonight. I'm actually sitting at home and don't have it up on my screen. So,
do you want me to share it? I have it up already.
Sure.
Okay.
And then Sarah wants to share their contact information too. So Sarah, are you cool doing it right after we showed this one? Okay, cool. Thanks.
Okay. Whoops, hang on. I'm sorry. It keeps moving away from me. Darn it. There we go. So we had asked Dan and Joanne to kind of, Joanne kind of touched on it earlier, if all 700 families came from the school district of Beloit, what would that do to our budget? And of course, assuming that everything stays as it is. We know in school funding, things change quite frequently, and this is a little ways into the future. But assuming everything stays the same, what would happen.
Yes. And okay, so the first question, and really truly want to put the caveat out here. This is just looking at some of the ideas that we have right now. And this is not anything that anybody should take as these are the exact numbers, these are what we will see. There are so many factors into what will and can happen. And as I said, we use a 3-year rolling average for membership. And so this is giving a high level. If you're looking at 700 kids, and we know those 700 kids may not come all at one time, they're going to be staggering that. So I really truly want to put that caveat out here that someone's not looking at this saying, hey, this is exactly what's going to happen. So what we did is, just to give that high overview, is saying that the impact of 700 kids, just based on what we are anticipating would be the amount that we pay to the charter school, is that $9,165. So that has a $6.4 million impact on the district when you take child for child. And then we would experience, when I just put into a hypothetical, if we had a 700 student membership decline in 1 year in that 3-year rolling, which we're already in a declining, we would get a $3.6 million declining enrollment exemption. And that's based on the last 2 years of we've had declining enrollment that are not at all impacted by the charter schools. So that is, like I said, just taking that shot, which would give us about a $2.79 million difference in our funding. And so in looking at that, if that 3 years continued to trend where we only lost that 700 the 1 year, and we continued to do that, and assuming the declining enrollment continued for those next years, we could be looking at, if you scroll down, it would be the 2.79 for year 1, 2.79 for year 2, and then third year, because those other years have dropped off, we could be looking at that $6.4 million, which would result in, over that 3-year period, an $11.98 million impact. So that is huge. But like I said, you can't attribute everything to that charter school in this concept, because it is a 3-year average and you're not losing 700 right there. So that's where the 2.7 and that declining enrollment exemption truly does come into play. So, just very cautious on looking at these numbers and how you're interpreting those numbers. This is that very high overview look. So the other questions that were asked, if you scroll back up a little bit, was how much we're receiving in per pupil aid. This is not the per pupil aid. This is just when you start looking at our revenue limit worksheets on line 3, it indicates what we get per pupil. And so when looking at our 2021, we are estimating 9852. This is all very subject to change as we continue to go through and what our actual enrollment numbers are. But what we're looking at for 2021 planning on our revenue limit sheet is a 9852. So when they talk about the difference in what you fund to the charter school and what the district receives, that difference is approximately that $700 difference between the 9852 and the 9165, that the district would still retain, if that's what you want to, how you classify that. Mm-hmm. The next question is, do we have to provide title funds to Lincoln Academy? No, we would not, because they are their own LEA. So unlike the the private schools that some of our students are choosing to go to or open enrolling out to, we do not have to provide those funds and those services like we do to private schools. They are their own entity, independent, and they will get those allocations directly from the state and those allocations on their own. So it isn't us sending that money. Transportation, again, like the private schools, we do not need to provide them transportation because they are their own LEA, they are on the group. But it's important for families to know, to ask, is Lincoln Academy going to provide their transportation? Because they're not required to provide transportation as a charter school. Not saying they can't, but they don't have to, and the district does not have to provide that transportation or parent contract to them either. So that is not going to be a requirement on School District of Beloit for supporting Lincoln Academy. And then kind of asking about any potential services that we would have to provide to Academy. What I was specifically targeting there in my answer is like special ed services, pupil services for counseling and psychology, social work, and athletics and things. What we were looking at is no, because they are their own LEA. If they want to have a team, if they want to do those things, they would be responsible for doing them themselves. Homeschool is a very different animal in what we have to provide to them. So, I had a couple conversations with DPI. I also had sent an email to Cassandra asking, how does this play out? So getting those very broad questions answered for you. I think I kind of summarized those, but I cannot caution enough on when you're looking at those dollar amounts, those are highly susceptible to change and looking at it. So I don't want anybody to take this information and say, this is what Joanne said we're going to lose and what we're going to gain, and go to the bank on that, because these are susceptible to many, many changes by the state, by our enrollment. They are very fluid, but there is a significant amount that can be attributed to the charter school if they truly get those numbers. But we need to be cognizant as a district as well. We are looking at two different scenarios here, and they're both playing together, which our declining enrollment is here. It has been here. We are dealing with that. Yes, you can stop sharing. Will compound that process and that downward trend if we don't figure out how to stop that on our own.
Yeah, thank you very much. I know you love to be accurate, and you love to. I know that was probably a little bit hard for you to do, but I think it's information that we as board members and as a community kind of need to start wrapping our mind around as we look at the impact of the Lincoln Academy as it comes into our community. So thank you. I
appreciate that, Kyle, that was very painful for me.
It was. I know, I work too long enough, I know. So thank you very much again for putting that together for us.
You did a great job.
All right. Okay. And then, Sarah, you had offered to put up your last slide so that people at home could reach out to you if they wanted to. Please, thank you. Before we call tonight.
Yeah, thank you. I just thought, because the chat's not public, and I put my link to the slides in the chat so somebody can put it in the minutes, because it should be viewable for anyone with the link. And then Nick and I, these are our cell phones, our email addresses, and our website is wrccs.org. And like I said, we just have tons of resources. We have the conference, and then we're here to just answer questions from individuals from any background, parents, community members, teachers, board members, you name it. So certainly do reach out. If you want any of the documents, that aren't in the slides that we sort of referred to tonight, certainly just shoot us an email and we will send them your way.
Thank you very much. And Michelle followed the link and she linked it to the agenda on board docs too.
Perfect.
Thank you both again for being here with us tonight and walking us through this and answering our questions. We very much appreciate it.
Yep.
Absolutely.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Have a good night. All right. Board members, that brings us to adjournment. We've taken care of all of the business. Is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
We have a motion, a second to adjourn the meeting tonight. Are there any questions or discussion about adjournment or any business we missed? Hearing none, all in favor of adjournment, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a great
Bye.
night.